This is On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason, written by Arthur Schopenhauer, author's preface to the second edition. This work on the foundations of philosophy first appeared in 1813, when it earned me my doctorate. It later became the bedrock of my entire philosophical system. For that reason, I couldn't allow it to stay out of print, which, I recently discovered, it has been for the past 4 years without my knowledge. At the same time, I couldn't in good conscience send a young man's work back out into the world with all its flaws intact. I know the day is coming when I won't be able to make any more corrections. But it's precisely after that day that my real influence will begin, and I expect it to last a long time. I take comfort in what Seneca promised. Even if envy silences every living person around you, there will come those who judge without prejudice and without favor. So I've done everything I could to improve this work. And given how short and uncertain life is, I consider it a rare stroke of luck to have been able at 60 to correct what I wrote at 26. Still, I tried to go easy on my younger self. Wherever I could, I let him speak freely and follow his own train of thought. But wherever he got something wrong, said something unnecessary, or missed the most important point entirely, I had to step in and interrupt him, and that happened often. So often that some readers may feel they're listening to an old man read a young man's book aloud, repeatedly setting it down to go off on his own tangents. It's obvious that a book revised across such a long gap of time can never have the unity and wholeness of something written in one sitting. The difference in style between the two versions is so striking that any perceptive reader will always know who is speaking, the young man or the old one. The contrast is sharp. The young man writes with quiet, modest confidence, still naive enough to believe that everyone who calls themselves a philosopher genuinely cares about truth above everything else, and that anyone who advances truth will be welcomed for it. The old man speaks with a firmer, sometimes harsher voice, the voice of someone who has come to understand the true character and real motives of the academic world he landed in. A fair reader won't hold it against him if he occasionally lets his frustration show. What else should we expect when people who claim truth as their only goal spend all their time calculating how to serve whoever holds power over them? When the old saying, "You can carve a god out of any block of wood," gets applied even to the greatest philosophers, and a crude fraud like Hegel gets casually ranked among them? German philosophy at that point stood as an object of contempt to the rest of the world, expelled from honest intellectual life, like someone who sells themselves to whoever pays that day. An entire generation of academics, their minds wrecked by Hegelian nonsense, incapable of genuine thought, coarse and disoriented, fell straight into the arms of a crude materialism that crawled out from under that rotten foundation. So be it. I return to my subject. Readers will simply have to accept the unevenness of tone in this work. I couldn't do here what I did in my main work, collect all the later additions into a separate appendix. And frankly, it doesn't matter whether readers know which parts I wrote at 26 and which at 60. What matters is this. Anyone who wants to work through the foundational principles of all philosophical thinking and come away with solid footing and genuine clarity should find in this small book something real, rigorous, and true. I believe they will. In its expanded form, this work has grown into a thorough theory of the entire human capacity for knowledge. By staying tightly focused on the principle of sufficient reason, it illuminates that capacity from a new and distinctive angle, though it reaches its full completion in the first book of the world as will and representation, along with the corresponding chapters of the second volume, and in my critique of Kantian philosophy. Arthur Schopenhauer, Frankfurt am Main, September 1847. Chapter 1. Introduction. Section 1. The Method. Plato and Kant. two of the greatest philosophical minds who ever lived, speak with one voice when it comes to the method that should guide all philosophy and science. There are two laws, they tell us, that must be followed equally, neither sacrificed for the other. The first is the law of homogeneity. This law tells us to group things together by their similarities, gathering individual things into kinds, kinds into species, species into genera, and so on, climbing upward until we reach the most universal concept possible. This law is built into reason itself. It assumes that nature actually cooperates with this tendency in our minds, an idea the ancients captured in the phrase, "Entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity." The second is the law of specification. Kant states it this way: the variety of things must not be carelessly reduced. This law pushes in the opposite direction. It demands that we clearly distinguish the different categories falling under any general concept. It requires that we keep higher and lower species separate, skip nothing, and never dump a specific case directly under a broad heading just because it's convenient. Every concept can always be broken down further. None of them reaches all the way down to a single concrete perception. Kant argues that both laws are hardwired into human reason, principles our minds apply automatically, assuming in advance that reality will conform to them. Plato makes the same point in his own dramatic way, saying these rules were hurled down to humanity along with the fire Prometheus stole from the gods. Section 2. Applying this method to our subject. Despite the authority of both Plato and Kant, I find that the second law, the law of specification, has almost never been applied to one of the most foundational principles in all of knowledge, the principle of sufficient reason. This principle has been stated in general form for a long time, but philosophers have consistently failed to distinguish clearly between its very different applications. In each application, the principle takes on a new meaning, and that new meaning points back to a different source within the human mind. If you compare Kant's philosophy to everything that came before it, you can see that enormous, persistent errors arose precisely because philosophers over-applied the law of homogeneity, lumping things together that should have been kept apart, while ignoring specification entirely. Kant's greatest discoveries, by contrast, came from doing the opposite, carefully separating what had been wrongly merged. With that in mind, I want to quote a passage from Kant in which he specifically recommends applying the law of specification to the sources of human knowledge, because it speaks directly to what this book is trying to do. It is of the highest importance to isolate the various kinds of knowledge that differ from one another in type and origin, and to take great care that they not be mixed together. What the chemist does in analyzing substances and what the mathematician does in pure mathematics is far more urgently required of the philosopher, so that he can clearly identify what part of any given act of understanding belongs to a specific kind of knowledge, and what that knowledge's particular value and reach actually are. Section 3. What this inquiry is good for. If I succeed in showing that the principle of sufficient reason does not flow from a single unified concept in the intellect, but rather from several different ones, then it follows that the necessity it carries with it cannot be one and the same in every case. It must be just as varied as the sources of the principle itself. Anyone who bases a conclusion on this principle is therefore obligated to specify clearly which of its grounds of necessity they are actually relying on, and to name that ground distinctly, as I am about to do. I hope this will be a step toward greater clarity and precision in philosophical thinking. I consider extreme clarity, achieved through precise definition of every single term, to be indispensable, both as a defense against error and against deliberate deception, and as a way of locking down each newly discovered idea so firmly that no future misunderstanding can take it away from us. The genuine philosopher always seeks light and clarity. He should aim to be like a Swiss mountain lake, so calm that its great depth shows right through its perfectly clear surface, the depth revealed by the clarity rather than hidden by it. He should not be like a muddy, rushing torrent. As Vauvenargues put it, clarity is the honesty of philosophers. Pseudo-philosophers, on the other hand, use language not to hide their thoughts, as Talleyrand said people do, but to hide the fact that they have no thoughts at all. They make the reader feel responsible for failing to understand when the real problem is their own confused thinking. This is why certain writers, Schelling, for instance, so often slip from a tone of instruction into a tone of reproach, scolding the reader in advance for their supposed inability to follow along. Section 4. Why the principle of sufficient reason matters. The importance of this principle is immense. It is, quite simply, the foundation of all science. By science, I mean a system of connected ideas, a coherent whole, not a random pile of unrelated facts. And what holds a system together, if not the principle of sufficient reason? What separates any science from a mere heap of information is precisely this. Its ideas are derived from one another, each following from what came before it as from its reason. Plato saw this long ago. Even true opinions, he wrote, aren't worth much until they are anchored by reasoning from causes, tied down to their reasons. And nearly every science involves both causal reasoning, deriving effects from causes, and logical reasoning, deriving conclusions from premises. Aristotle put it plainly. Every intellectual science, or anything that participates in intellect at all, concerns itself with causes and principles. It is precisely the assumption built into us before all experience, that everything must have a reason, that licenses us to ask why about anything at all. That one small word, why, is the mother of all science. Section 5. The principle itself. Later in this work, I'll show that the principle of sufficient reason is a single label covering several distinct concepts that we know prior to all experience. For now, I need to state it in some form. I'll use the formulation by Wolff, which I find the most comprehensive. Nothing exists without a reason why it exists, rather than not existing. Chapter 2. A survey of the most important views on the principle of sufficient reason. Section 6. First statement of the principle, and the distinction between two of its meanings. A principle this fundamental to all knowledge must have been recognized and put into words very early in human history. It would be difficult, and not especially interesting, to try to pinpoint exactly where it first appeared. Neither Plato nor Aristotle ever formally stated it as a leading foundational principle, though both treat it constantly as a self-evident truth. Plato, for instance, says with a kind of innocent simplicity, innocent in the way that precedes any critical philosophical self-examination, that everything which comes into being must do so through some cause, for how could anything come to be without one? And again, everything that comes into being necessarily does so through some cause, since it is impossible for anything to arise without one. Plutarch, at the end of his book on fate, lists among the chief propositions of the Stoics, first and foremost, it must be held that nothing happens without a cause. Everything happens through prior causes. Aristotle, in his Posterior Analytics, comes close to stating the principle of sufficient reason when he says, "We think we truly know a thing when we know the cause on account of which it is, that this cause is indeed the cause of it, and that it could not be otherwise." In his Metaphysics, Aristotle already divides causes, or rather principles, into different kinds, admitting as many as 8 of them, but the division is neither deep enough nor precise enough. He is nevertheless right to say, what all principles have in common is that they are the primary source from which a thing either exists, or comes to be, or is known. In the following chapters, he distinguishes several kinds of causes, though somewhat superficially and confusedly. In the Posterior Analytics, he gives a more satisfactory account of 4 kinds of cause. First, what a thing essentially is. Second, what must be the case given certain conditions. Third, what first set something in motion. And fourth, the purpose for the sake of which something exists. This is the origin of the fourfold division of causes that became standard among the scholastic philosophers: material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and final cause, as laid out in the works of Suarez, which amount to a comprehensive encyclopedia of scholasticism. Even Hobbes still quotes and explains this division. Now, the vitally important distinction between a logical reason and a physical cause, Aristotle does show some awareness of it in the Posterior Analytics, where he takes considerable trouble to show that knowing and proving that something exists is a very different matter from knowing and proving why it exists. What he calls the latter is knowledge of the cause. What he calls the former is knowledge of the reason. But if he had grasped this distinction with full clarity, he would never have lost sight of it. He would have held on to it consistently throughout his writings. And that is precisely what he does not do. Even when he tries to distinguish the different kinds of causes from one another, in the very passages I just mentioned, the essential distinction he touched on in that earlier chapter never seems to come back to him. On top of that, he uses the same word, the Greek word for cause, indiscriminately for every kind of ground or reason. He frequently calls logical grounds of knowledge causes, and sometimes even calls the premises of an argument causes of the conclusion. Using the same word for two closely related but genuinely distinct concepts is a reliable sign that the difference between them has not been recognized, or at least not firmly grasped. A merely accidental overlap in terminology between two completely different things would be another matter. But this is not that. Nowhere does this error show up more glaringly than in Aristotle's definition of the sophism known as non-cause treated as cause. Reasoning from something that is not actually a cause as though it were one. By cause, in that context, he means nothing other than an argument, a premise. In other words, a logical ground of knowledge. The sophism he's describing consists in correctly proving that something is impossible, while the proof has no bearing whatsoever on the proposition actually in dispute, which it is nonetheless supposed to refute. There is no physical causation involved at all. Yet the use of the word cause in this context has weighed so heavily on later logicians that they have taken it to refer to a physical cause when explaining this sophism, which is simply wrong. Reimarus does this, and so do Schulze and Fries. In fact, every treatment of the subject I've encountered makes the same mistake. The first work in which I find a correct definition of this sophism is Tweston's Logic. And in most other scientific and philosophical controversies, the charge of non-cause treated as cause is typically used to mean the introduction of a wrong physical cause, which again misses Aristotle's original point entirely. Sextus Empiricus gives us another vivid example of how the ancients habitually confused the logical law of the ground of knowledge with the transcendental law of cause and effect in nature, persistently mistaking one for the other. In his work Against the Mathematicians, he undertakes to prove the law of causality, and argues as follows. Whoever claims there is no cause either has a cause for that claim or does not. If he does not, his claim has no more validity than its opposite. If he does, then his very claim proves the existence of cause. This argument shows clearly that the ancients had not yet arrived at a clean distinction between requiring a logical reason as the ground for a conclusion and asking for a physical cause for the occurrence of a real event in the world. As for the scholastic philosophers of later centuries, the law of causality was in their eyes an axiom beyond all investigation. As Suarez put it, we do not inquire whether a cause exists because nothing is more self-evident. At the same time, they held firmly to the Aristotelian classification of causes. But as far as I can determine, They too never arrived at a clear understanding of the distinction we are examining here. Section 7. Descartes. Even the great Descartes, who gave the first real push toward subjective philosophical reflection and thereby became the father of modern philosophy, was still tangled up in confusions that are hard to account for. And we'll see shortly what serious and damaging consequences those confusions had for metaphysics. In his reply to the second set of objections to the Meditations on First Philosophy, he states as his first axiom, "Nothing exists of which one cannot ask what the cause of its existence is." This can even be asked of God himself, not because he needs any cause in order to exist, but because the immensity of his own nature is the cause, or reason, why he needs no cause in order to exist. What Descartes should have said is this: the immensity of God is a logical reason from which it follows that God needs no cause. Instead, he runs the two together, cause and reason, and it's clear he has no firm awareness of the difference between them. But this confusion is not accidental. It serves a purpose. Where the law of causality demands a cause, he quietly substitutes a logical reason instead. Because a logical reason, unlike a physical cause, does not automatically push you to look for something further beyond it. And by means of this very axiom, he clears the path to the ontological proof of God's existence, which was really his invention. Anselm had only gestured at it in a vague and general way. Immediately following these axioms, Descartes presents a formal and completely serious version of the ontological proof, which was already sitting inside that first axiom the whole time, the way a chick sits inside an egg that has been brooded over long enough. So, while everything else requires a cause for its existence, the immensity implied in our concept of God, a concept we arrived at by climbing the ladder of the cosmological proof, is said to serve in place of a cause. As the proof itself puts it, necessary existence is contained within the concept of a supremely perfect being. That is the sleight of hand. The confusion between reason and cause, familiar even to Aristotle, gets deployed here directly in the service of theology. Looked at in plain daylight, without any prior commitment to the conclusion, the famous ontological proof is really just a charming trick. At some point, someone constructs a concept out of a collection of attributes and takes care to include among those attributes the predicate of actual existence, either stated openly or wrapped up decorously inside some other predicate like perfection, immensity, or something similar. Now, it is well known that from any given concept, the predicates essential to it, those without which it cannot be coherently thought, can be extracted through pure logical analysis. These predicates and their implications have logical truth. They have their ground of knowledge in the concept itself. So existence gets extracted from this arbitrarily constructed concept, and an object corresponding to it is promptly declared to have real existence independent of the concept. As the German poet puts it, if the thought weren't so damnably clever, one would be tempted to call it straightforwardly stupid. The simplest answer to any ontological argument is this: everything depends on where your concept came from. If it came from experience, fine. The object exists and needs no further proof. If you hatched it inside your own head, then no matter how many predicates you pile onto it, they amount to nothing. It's a fantasy. And it does theology no favors that it felt the need to resort to arguments like this in order to gain a foothold on philosophical territory that is entirely foreign to it. Territory it has no business occupying, but desperately wants to. And yet, what prophetic insight Aristotle showed. He had never heard of the ontological proof. But it is as though he could sense this piece of scholastic conjuring coming through the darkness of future centuries and wanted to block the road to it in advance. He carefully demonstrates that defining a thing and proving its existence are two completely separate operations, forever distinct from one another. because through the first we learn what something means, and through the second we learn that it actually exists. Like an oracle speaking to the future, he lays down the verdict. Existence is never part of the essence of anything, since being is not a genus. In other words, existence can never belong to the nature of a thing. Schelling, by contrast, had enormous admiration for the ontological proof, as can be seen in a long footnote in the first volume of his philosophical writings of 1809. That footnote also shows something else instructive: how easily Germans allow themselves to be dazzled by impudence and bluster. As for Hegel, that thoroughly pitiable figure, whose entire pseudo-philosophy is nothing but a monstrous inflation of the ontological proof, that he actually took it upon himself to defend the proof against Kant, is an alliance the proof itself should be embarrassed by, little as it is generally given to blushing. How am I supposed to speak with respect about men who have dragged philosophy into contempt? Section 8. Spinoza. Spinoza's philosophy is centered on rejecting the double dualism his teacher Descartes had set up, the dualism between God and the world, and the dualism between soul and body. But despite breaking with Descartes on those fundamental points, Spinoza remained completely loyal to him in one critical error. He too confused and interchanged the relation between a logical reason and its consequence with the relation between a physical cause and its effect. He didn't just inherit this confusion, he pushed it further than Descartes had, making it the actual foundation of his entire pantheism. Here is what I mean. Any concept contains within itself, implicitly, all the predicates essential to it. These can be drawn out explicitly through purely analytical judgments, and the total of them constitutes the concept's definition. A definition therefore differs from the concept itself only in form, not in content. It consists of judgments that are all already contained within the concept, and which have their ground in it, since they spell out what the concept essentially is. We can think of these judgments as consequences that follow from the concept as their reason. Now, this relationship between a concept and the judgments that can be analytically derived from it is precisely the relationship Spinoza sets up between his so-called God and the world, or more precisely, between the one and only substance and its infinite attributes and modes. God, or substance consisting of infinite attributes. God, or all of God's attributes. This is the relationship in knowledge between a reason and its consequences. It is a logical relationship. True theism, and Spinoza's theism is theism in name only, assumes something completely different, a causal relationship, the relationship between a cause and its effect. In a genuine causal relationship, the cause remains distinct from its effect, not just in the way we happen to think about them, but really and essentially in themselves, permanently and forever. The word God, used honestly, means precisely a cause of this kind, a cause of the world, with the addition of personality. An impersonal God is a flat contradiction in terms. But Spinoza wanted to keep the word God while describing something that functions only as a logical reason, not a genuine cause. The only way he could do this was to thoroughly blend the two relationships together, to mix the principle of logical ground with the principle of physical causality until they were indistinguishable. The following passages make this plain. He writes, "It must be noted that for every existing thing, there is necessarily a certain definite cause on account of which it exists. And it must be noted that this cause, on account of which a thing exists, must either be contained in the very nature and definition of the existing thing, namely when existence belongs to its nature, or must be located outside it. In the second case, he means an efficient cause, as the context makes clear. In the first case, he means nothing more than a logical ground of knowledge. Yet he identifies the two, and by doing so, he prepares the way for identifying God with the world, which is his whole agenda. This is the trick he uses constantly, and which he learned from Descartes, substituting an internal logical reason for an external physical cause. He then writes, "From the necessity of the divine nature, everything that can fall within the scope of infinite intellect must follow." Yet at the same time he calls God the cause of everything throughout his work. Whatever exists expresses the power of God, which is the cause of all things. God is the immanent cause of all things, not a cause that acts from outside. God is the efficient cause not only of the existence of things, but of their essence. From any given idea, some effect must necessarily follow, and no thing can be destroyed except by an external cause. He then demonstrates this last point as follows. The definition of anything affirms its essence, what it is, but does not negate it. So, as long as we attend only to the thing itself, and not to external causes, we can find nothing in it that could destroy it. This means, he argues, that just as no concept can contain anything that contradicts its own definition, no existing thing can contain within itself a cause of its own destruction. But here he is confusing two entirely different things: a contradiction within a definition, which would undermine the concept, with a physical cause capable of destroying an actually existing thing. These are not the same at all. This need to run cause and reason together becomes so pressing for Spinoza that he can never write one word alone. He always has to write reason or cause, Latin ratio seu causa, pairing them every single time. In one single page of his work, this combined phrase appears 8 times, as though repetition could conceal the sleight of hand. Descartes had done exactly the same thing in the axiom I discussed earlier, section 9. Leibniz. Leibniz was the first to formally state the principle of sufficient reason as a foundational principle of all knowledge, though even he did not handle it with full consistency or clarity. He proclaims it loudly and invokes it constantly. But he never once provides a genuine proof of it. He simply asserts it, and he uses it in 2 completely different senses, without ever clearly acknowledging that he is doing so, sometimes meaning a logical ground of knowledge, sometimes meaning a physical cause in the real world, slipping between the two as the argument requires. In his Monadology and in the Principles of Nature and Grace, he states the principle explicitly and divides all truths into 2 kinds: truths of reason and truths of fact. Truths of reason are necessary. Their opposite is impossible. Truths of fact are contingent. Things could have been otherwise. For truths of reason, he says, the sufficient reason is found by analysis, resolving them into simpler ideas and simpler truths until we reach the primitive ones. For truths of fact, the sufficient reason must ultimately be found in a necessary being, that is, in God, who contains within himself the reason for his own existence. Now, here is the problem. For truths of reason, the sufficient reason Leibniz appeals to is purely logical. It is the principle of contradiction. A necessary truth is one whose denial is self-contradictory. That is a logical ground. For truths of fact, however, the sufficient reason he appeals to is causal. It is the chain of physical causes reaching back through the contingent world until it terminates in God as the ultimate cause. These are 2 completely different kinds of ground. One is logical, the other is causal. Leibniz runs them together under the single label of sufficient reason, without ever drawing a firm line between them. Beyond this, his use of the principle to establish the existence of God, by arguing that the chain of contingent causes must terminate in a necessary being who is his own sufficient reason, imports into the causal chain a concept that belongs only to the logical domain. A necessary being, in Leibniz's sense, is one whose non-existence would be a logical contradiction. But the law of causality, which governs the real world of experience, knows nothing of logical necessity. It simply says that every event has a cause. It does not say that the chain must terminate anywhere, and it certainly does not license the introduction of a being defined by logical necessity into a sequence of physical causes. This is precisely the confusion between reason and cause that Descartes introduced and that Leibniz inherited without resolving. Leibniz also invokes the principle of sufficient reason in another context entirely, in his dispute with the Newtonians over absolute space. He argues that if space were absolute, that is, if it existed independently of the things in it, then God would have had no sufficient reason to place the universe in one position in absolute space rather than any other, since all positions would be completely identical. Therefore, he concludes, absolute space cannot exist. This is a very different use of the principle. Here it functions as a demand for a comprehensible reason for God's choices, a kind of rational intelligibility requirement applied to divine action. It has nothing to do with either logical necessity or physical causation in the ordinary sense. So, in Leibniz, we already see the principle being stretched across at least three distinct applications: logical grounding, physical causation, and rational intelligibility, without any of these being carefully distinguished from the others. The principle is invoked constantly, with great confidence, but its actual meaning shifts quietly, depending on what Leibniz needs it to do at any given moment. He also states the principle in the form that became most famous. Nothing happens without a reason why it is thus, and not otherwise. This formulation is broad enough to cover all the different applications, which is precisely why it is useful, and precisely why it is dangerous. Its very generality conceals the fundamental differences between those applications, and it is those differences that this entire work is dedicated to exposing. Section 10. Wolff. Christian Wolff defined the principle of sufficient reason as follows: nothing exists without a sufficient reason why it exists, rather than not existing. This is the formulation I quoted at the end of the previous chapter, and it is the clearest and most comprehensive statement of the principle that had appeared up to that point. Wolff was aware that the principle needed some kind of proof, unlike Leibniz, who simply proclaimed it as self-evident. But the proof Wolff offers is not convincing. He argues that if something existed without a sufficient reason, then nothing would be its sufficient reason, and nothing cannot be the reason of something. This is circular. He is essentially saying, if something had no reason, then its reason would be nothing. But nothing cannot be a reason. Therefore, everything must have a reason. But this simply assumes what needs to be proved. The fact that nothing cannot serve as a reason is not a substantive logical truth. It is just a restatement of the claim that a reason must exist. Wolff also takes the important step of distinguishing between the reason of existence and the reason of knowledge, that is, between the ground that explains why something exists in the real world and the ground that explains why we know or assert something to be true. This distinction points in the right direction. It gestures toward the deeper division I am working toward in this book. But Wolff never develops it fully or consistently. He marks the distinction and then proceeds to ignore it whenever it suits him, collapsing cause and reason back into each other just as freely as his predecessors did. He also distinguishes between a determining reason and a sufficient reason, defining a determining reason as one that not only explains why something exists, but explains why it exists in this particular way and not in some other way. This refinement is useful. It captures something important, that a full explanation must account not just for the existence of a thing, but for its specific character and properties. But again, Wolff does not follow this through with enough rigor to avoid the old confusions. What Wolff contributes, in the end, is clarity of formulation and a degree of systematic organization that his predecessors lacked. He brings the principle into sharper focus as a principle, as something that can be stated, examined, and, to some extent, argued for. But he does not get to the bottom of it. He does not ask seriously enough where the principle comes from, what its source in the human mind actually is, or why it takes such different forms in different contexts. The same must be said of all the other pre-Kantian philosophers of the German school: Baumgarten, Meyer, Reimarus, Mendelssohn, Tietgens, and the rest. They all treat the principle of sufficient reason as a single, unified, self-evident axiom. They apply it freely across logic, metaphysics, and physics, without noticing that what they are applying in each domain is not quite the same principle at all. They inherit the ambiguity from Leibniz and Wolff and pass it on intact. There is one thing, however, that should be said in Wolff's favor on a related matter. In his universal ontology, he divides causes into 4 kinds, following Aristotle and the scholastics: material, formal, efficient, and final. He adds to this a useful discussion of the difference between cause in the strict sense, the efficient cause, the cause that actually produces an effect in the real world, and reason in the logical sense, the ground from which a conclusion follows. He is at least conscious that these are different, but consciousness of a distinction and rigorous application of it are 2 different things. And it is the latter that is missing across the entire pre-Kantian tradition. The real breakthrough on this question had to wait for Kant. And it is to Kant that we now turn. Section 11. Hume. Before turning to Kant, I need to say something about Hume, because his skeptical attack on the concept of causality was the direct stimulus that, by Kant's own admission, woke him from his dogmatic slumber and set him on the path that led to the critique of pure reason. Hume's central argument about causality is this: we believe that every event has a cause, that causes necessarily produce their effects, that given a cause, its effect must follow. But where does this belief in necessity come from? We never actually perceive necessity in the world. What we perceive is simply this: one event follows another. We see the billiard ball strike the second ball, and we see the second ball move. But we do not see any necessary connection between these 2 events. We only see the sequence. The necessity we believe in, the sense that the second event had to follow from the first, is not something we observe in the world. It is something we add from our own minds. Hume's explanation of why we add it is psychological. We have seen the same sequence repeated over and over again. Through habit and custom, the perception of the first event triggers an expectation of the second. This expectation, repeated enough times, hardens into a feeling of necessity, a feeling that the second event must follow the first. But this feeling is just a psychological habit. It has no logical justification. It cannot be derived from reason alone, because reason alone could never tell us, prior to experience, that any particular cause must produce any particular effect. And it cannot be justified by experience either, because experience only ever shows us sequences, never necessity. The consequence Hume draws is radical. The concept of causality, the idea that causes necessarily produce their effects, has no rational foundation whatsoever. It is a habit of the mind, nothing more. And because the major proofs of metaphysics, the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, the freedom of the will, all depend on the principle of causality, those proofs collapse along with it. Metaphysics as a rational science is impossible. This was the challenge Kant took up, and it is important to understand exactly what Kant did and did not accept from Hume. Kant accepted Hume's central observation, that the necessity we attribute to causal connections cannot be derived from experience, because experience only ever shows us sequences, not necessities. On this point, Hume was entirely right, and Kant never disputed it. What Kant rejected was Hume's conclusion that the concept of causality is therefore nothing but a psychological habit with no rational validity. Kant's response was to ask, what if the concept of causality is not derived from experience at all, not because it is a mere habit, but because it belongs to the structure of the understanding itself, prior to all experience? What if it is one of the forms through which the mind organizes experience, a condition of the possibility of experience rather than a product of it? If that is the case, then the necessity we attribute to causal connections is perfectly real and perfectly justified. Not because we read it off the world, but because it is one of the ways in which the mind constitutes the world of experience in the first place. The world we experience is necessarily a world in which every event has a cause, not because that is a fact about things as they are in themselves, but because it is a condition built into the structure of human experience as such. This was Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus explained the apparent motions of the heavens by attributing them to the motion of the observer rather than the motion of the stars, Kant explained the apparent necessity we find in nature by attributing it to the structure of the observing mind rather than to the nature of things in themselves. This is the philosophical context into which my own investigation of the principle of sufficient reason must be placed. For Hume had attacked one form of the principle, the causal form, and shown that it cannot be derived from experience. Kant had defended it by showing that it belongs to the structure of the understanding itself. But neither of them had asked the deeper question, are there other forms of the principle besides the causal one? And if so, do they all have the same source, or different sources? These are the questions this book sets out to answer. Section 12. Kant. Kant's treatment of the principle of sufficient reason is spread across several of his works and is not gathered into one single place, which makes it somewhat difficult to assess as a whole. Let me go through the relevant passages. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant does not treat the principle of sufficient reason as a single unified principle at all. Instead, he breaks it apart, though without explicitly saying that is what he is doing, and distributes its different forms across different sections of his analysis of the understanding. The logical form of the principle, the demand that every judgment have a ground of knowledge, appears in his treatment of the logical functions of judgment, and in his account of the faculty of reason as such. Reason, for Kant, is precisely the faculty that demands grounds, that always asks for the condition of any given conditioned thing, and then for the condition of that condition, driving upward in an unending regress toward the unconditioned. This is what generates the dialectical illusions of traditional metaphysics, the cosmological idea of a first cause, the psychological idea of a simple and immortal soul, the theological idea of God as the ultimate ground of everything. All of these arise from reason's insatiable demand for a sufficient ground pushing beyond the limits of possible experience. The causal form of the principle, the demand that every event in the real world have a cause, appears in the second analogy of experience, which Kant titles the principle of temporal sequence according to the law of causality. This is his direct response to Hume. He argues that the concept of cause is a pure concept of the understanding, what he calls a category, that is applied to experience a priori, prior to and independently of any particular experience. It is precisely because the understanding applies this concept to all experience in advance that experience has the character of a lawful, causally connected whole rather than a chaotic sequence of unrelated impressions. Kant's proof of this, in the second analogy, is one of the most important and genuinely difficult arguments in the entire critique. The core of it runs roughly as follows. We experience events as objectively successive, as happening one after another in a determinate order that is not just the order in which we happen to perceive them. But what makes a sequence of perceptions objectively ordered rather than merely subjectively ordered? What distinguishes the objective succession of cause and effect from the merely subjective succession of my perceptions as I look first at one thing and then at another? The answer Kant gives is this. An objective succession is one in which the order of perceptions is irreversible, in which I could not have had them in the opposite order given the same objective situation. And what makes a succession irreversible is precisely the fact that the earlier event is the cause of the later one. Without the concept of causality, we could not distinguish objective successions from merely subjective ones. And therefore, we could not have any experience of an objective world at all. The concept of causality is therefore a necessary condition of the possibility of experience, which is why it carries genuine necessity and universal validity, despite not being derived from experience. This is a powerful argument. But I have reservations about some of the details of Kant's execution, which I will discuss later in this work when I present my own account of the causal form of the principle of sufficient reason. The form of the principle that governs mathematical relationships, the demand that every truth in geometry and arithmetic have a ground, appears in Kant's treatment of pure intuition in the transcendental aesthetic. Space and time, for Kant, are not concepts derived from experience, but pure forms of intuition that the mind brings to experience in advance. The truths of geometry are grounded in the pure intuition of space, and the truths of arithmetic are grounded in the pure intuition of time. These grounds are not logical grounds. They are not derived by analysis from concepts, but intuitive grounds, grounded in what we can directly construct and perceive in pure intuition. Kant calls this synthetic a priori knowledge, knowledge that is both genuinely informative and yet known independently of experience. Finally, the form of the principle that governs human action, the demand that every act of will have a motive, appears in Kant's practical philosophy, particularly in the critique of a practical reason and the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. Here, however, Kant's treatment becomes complicated by his doctrine of transcendental freedom, the idea that the will, considered as a thing in itself, is not subject to the law of causality at all, but is self-determining and autonomous. This creates a deep tension in Kant's philosophy between the causal determinism that governs the world of experience and the freedom he wants to attribute to the rational will. I will return to this tension later. What I want to emphasize here is this. Kant, more than any thinker before him, broke the principle of sufficient reason apart and recognized that it operates differently in different domains. He did not state this explicitly as a single overarching thesis, but the architecture of the critique of pure reason embodies it. The logical, the causal, the mathematical, and the motivational forms of the principle each receive separate treatment in different parts of his philosophy. This is an enormous step forward. It is the clearest application of the law of specification to this principle that had yet been made. But Kant did not finish the job. He did not gather these separate treatments together, compare them explicitly, show precisely how they differ from one another and what they have in common, trace each one back to its specific source in the human mind, and present the whole as a unified theory of the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason. That is what this book aims to do. Section 13. My own view. The principle has four distinct roots. Everything I have surveyed in the preceding sections leads to the following conclusion. The principle of sufficient reason is not one principle. It is four. Or, more precisely, it is a single general principle that manifests in four fundamentally different forms, each with a different source in the human mind, each governing a different class of objects, and each carrying a different kind of necessity. Previous philosophers either failed to notice this entirely, treating the principle as a single self-evident axiom to be applied freely everywhere, or they dimly sensed some of the differences without ever bringing them into clear focus. Even Kant, who came closest, did not gather the different forms together and present them as a unified fourfold structure. That is what I intend to do. Before I can do that, however, I need to lay some groundwork. I need to explain what kinds of objects the principle applies to in each of its four forms, because the differences between the forms are grounded in differences between the kinds of objects they govern. And to do that, I need to say something about the nature of objects in general, and about the relationship between the subject and the object of knowledge. I will do this as briefly and clearly as possible, since these matters have been treated at great length elsewhere, particularly in my chief work, and I do not want to repeat more than is strictly necessary here. Chapter 3. Insufficient Proofs of the Principle. Section 14. The proof must not be circular. Before setting out to prove the principle of sufficient reason in any of its forms, I need to deal with a methodological trap that is easy to fall into and that has in fact caught several eminent philosophers. The trap is this: any proof of the principle of sufficient reason must not itself rely on the principle of sufficient reason. If it does, the proof is circular. It assumes what it is trying to establish. This sounds obvious when stated plainly, but it is surprisingly easy to commit this error without noticing, because the principle is so deeply built into our thinking that we reach for it automatically, even when we are supposed to be proving it. Let me look at two attempts to prove the principle that fall into exactly this trap. The first is the proof offered by Wolff, which I mentioned earlier. Wolff argues, if something existed without a sufficient reason, then nothing would be its sufficient reason, but nothing cannot be the reason of something, therefore everything must have a sufficient reason. The problem here is not just that this is circular in the obvious sense of assuming the conclusion. The deeper problem is that the claim "nothing cannot be a reason" is itself an application of the principle. To say that nothing cannot ground anything is to presuppose that grounds are real and that their absence is significant, which is precisely what was supposed to be proved. Wolff has not proved the principle. He has restated it. The second is the proof attempted by various rationalist philosophers who argue that the denial of the principle leads to contradiction. They try to show that if anything could exist without a sufficient reason, then nothing could ever be known or explained, and therefore science and knowledge would be impossible. But this argument moves too fast. It assumes that the conditions required for knowledge are also the conditions required for reality, that whatever would make knowledge impossible must therefore be metaphysically impossible. That assumption is itself deeply questionable and requires its own justification. You cannot prove a fundamental principle of reality by pointing out that its denial would be inconvenient for science. A genuine proof of the principle of sufficient reason in any of its forms must show that the principle is a necessary condition of some form of experience or knowledge, that without it, a certain class of representations could not arise or be coherently organized at all. This is what Kant showed for the causal form of the principle in the second analogy, and it is what I will try to show for each of the four forms in the chapters that follow. But there is one more failed proof I need to address before moving on, and it is the most interesting of the three, because it was proposed by none other than one of Kant's most distinguished successors. Section 15. The proof attempted by Reinhold. Carl Leonhard Reinhold was one of the most influential popularizers of Kantian philosophy in the years immediately following the publication of the Critique of Pure Reason. He was also one of the first to attempt what he called an elementary philosophy, a philosophy that would go beneath Kant's own starting point and find an even more fundamental first principle from which everything else could be derived. His candidate for this role was what he called the principle of consciousness, the claim that in consciousness, the subject distinguishes the representation from both subject and object and relates it to both. Reinhold then attempted to derive the principle of sufficient reason from this principle of consciousness. His argument runs roughly as follows. In consciousness, every representation is related to an object as its ground and to a subject as its ground. A representation without a ground, whether objective or subjective, would be a representation that consciousness could not identify or distinguish. Therefore, every representation must have a ground. And this, he claims, is the principle of sufficient reason. This proof fails for several reasons. First, it is again circular. It uses the concept of a ground in the very premises from which it is supposed to derive the concept of a ground. Second, even if we grant the premises, what Reinhold derives is not the principle of sufficient reason in its full generality, but only a claim about representations, about the subjective conditions of consciousness. The principle of sufficient reason, as traditionally understood, makes a claim not just about representations, but about things, about reality itself. You cannot get from a claim about the conditions of consciousness to a claim about the structure of reality without a further argument that Reinhold never provides. Third, and most fundamentally, Reinhold's principle of consciousness is itself not as self-evident as he thinks. It is a substantive philosophical claim about the structure of consciousness, and it stands in need of its own justification. Building a proof of the principle of sufficient reason on top of it simply relocates the problem rather than solving it. What all these failed proofs have in common is this. They try to derive the principle of sufficient reason from something even more fundamental, from logic, from consciousness, from the conditions of knowledge, without recognizing that the principle itself, in its different forms, is already among the most fundamental conditions of experience and knowledge that we have. You cannot get beneath it, because there is nothing beneath it to stand on. What you can do, and what I intend to do, is describe it accurately, distinguish its different forms from one another, and show what each form governs and where each one comes from. That is the task of the remainder of this work. Chapter 4. On the predominant aspect of the principle of sufficient reason, the subject and the object. Section 16. The fundamental division of our representations. The world we are conscious of is, without exception, a world of representations. This is the starting point. Whatever I know, whatever I perceive, whatever I think about, all of it exists for me as a representation. This does not mean that nothing exists beyond representations. It means that whatever exists beyond them is, by definition, beyond my direct access. Everything that falls within the reach of my knowledge and experience falls within the domain of representation. Now, every representation has two sides. On one side stands the object, that which is represented. On the other side stands the subject, that which does the representing. These two are inseparable. There is no object without a subject to represent it, and there is no act of representing without something that is represented. They arise together and disappear together. Neither one has any meaning or existence apart from its relation to the other. This is the most fundamental fact about the world as we know it. The world is my representation, not in the sense that I create it arbitrarily or that it has no reality beyond my whims, but in the strict philosophical sense that the world as I know it is always and necessarily the world as it appears to a knowing subject, organized and structured by the forms and conditions that the subject brings to the act of knowing. Kant established this with finality. Before Kant, philosophers argued endlessly about whether the world we perceive corresponds to reality as it is in itself, whether our representations are accurate copies of things that exist independently of us. Kant showed that this question, posed in that form, cannot even be coherently answered, because the very concepts we would need to use in answering it, space, time, causality, are forms that the mind imposes on experience, not features that we read off from mind-independent reality. The world as it is in itself, the thing in itself, is permanently beyond our reach. The world we know is the world as representation. This does not lead to solipsism or to the conclusion that there is nothing real. It leads to the recognition that reality, as far as we can know it, is always reality, as structured by the conditions of possible experience. And the principle of sufficient reason, in its different forms, is one of the most fundamental of those conditions. Section 17. The object in general. Now, I need to say something more precise about the object side of this fundamental subject-object relation. Objects, things as they appear to a knowing subject, fall into four fundamentally different classes. Each class has its own character, its own mode of existence, and its own form of the principle of sufficient reason governing it. Distinguishing these four classes clearly is the key to everything that follows. The four classes are these. The first class consists of complete empirical representations, actual perceptions of things in space and time. These are the objects of ordinary experience, the physical world as we directly perceive it. The principle of sufficient reason governs this class in the form of the law of causality. Every change in the physical world, every event, has a cause. This is the causal form of the principle. The second class consists of abstract representations, concepts. These are not perceptions, but thoughts. They are representations of representations, second-order objects that stand at one remove from direct experience. The principle of sufficient reason governs this class in the form of the logical law of the ground of knowledge. Every judgment, every claim that something is true, must have a ground that justifies it. This is the logical form of the principle. The third class consists of the pure forms of outer and inner intuition, space and time considered in themselves, apart from any particular objects that fill them. These are the objects of mathematics, of geometry, which studies space, and of arithmetic, which studies time. The principle of sufficient reason governs this class in the form of the ground of being, the principle that every geometrical or arithmetical truth has a ground in the structure of pure intuition itself. This is the mathematical form of the principle. The fourth class consists of the subject of willing, the self as agent, as the one who acts and chooses. This is not an object of outer perception at all, but something known in a completely unique and direct way from the inside. The principle of sufficient reason governs this class in the form of the law of motivation. Every act of will has a motive, a cause that operates not through physical force, but through knowledge, through the presentation of an object to a willing subject. This is the motivational form of the principle. These four classes of objects, and the four corresponding forms of the principle of sufficient reason, are what the rest of this book is devoted to exploring. But before I go into each one in detail, I need to say a little more about the general nature of the subject-object relation and about the knowing subject as such. Section 18. The subject. The subject is the knower. It is that which knows everything and is itself known by nothing. It is the necessary correlate of every object, the one condition that must be present for any object to exist as an object at all. Remove the subject, and the entire world of representation vanishes with it, not because the subject creates things out of nothing, but because without a knower there is simply no world as known, no appearance, no experience. The subject itself has no size, no location, no properties that could be perceived or measured. It is not in space or time. It is not an object among other objects. It is the precondition for there being objects at all. This is why the subject can never become its own object in the ordinary sense. The eye cannot see itself seeing. The hand cannot grasp itself grasping. When we try to introspect and make the subject into an object of knowledge, what we find is always already something on the object side, a thought, a feeling, a memory, a perception. The pure subject, the knower as such, slips away from every attempt to pin it down as a thing. And yet the subject is not nothing. It is the most immediately certain thing there is. Descartes was right about that much. Whatever else I might doubt, I cannot doubt that there is doubting going on, that there is a knowing, experiencing subject. The subject is the starting point that cannot itself be questioned, because any questioning already presupposes it. What the subject is in itself, beyond its role as the knower of objects, is the deepest question in all of philosophy. My answer to that question is given in my chief work. The subject, considered in itself and apart from its role as knower, is will. But that answer takes us beyond what is needed for the purposes of the present investigation. Here we are concerned only with the subject in its cognitive role, as the knower whose forms of knowing give rise to the four forms of the principle of sufficient reason. Section 19. The class of representations, subject to the principle of sufficient reason of becoming, complete empirical representations. Now I turn to the first and most important class of objects, complete empirical representations, the objects of direct perception in the physical world. These are what most people mean when they talk about the world at all. They are the things we see, hear, touch, smell, and taste. They are extended in space, and they change in time. They are the objects of natural science in the broadest sense. What is the form of the principle of sufficient reason that governs this class? It is the law of causality. Every change, every event, and every alteration in the state of a physical object must have a cause. The cause is always a prior state of the physical world, and the effect is the subsequent state that necessarily follows from it, given the laws of nature. This is the principle of sufficient reason in its first and most fundamental form. I call it the principle of sufficient reason of becoming, because it governs how things come to be what they are, how states change, how events arise from prior conditions. The word becoming is deliberate. This form of the principle does not say that things exist for a reason. It says that changes happen for a reason. The law of causality is not a law about existence as such. It is a law about change. It says that whenever a new state of affairs arises, whenever something becomes different from what it was, there must be a prior cause that produced that change. The stone was at rest, and then it moved. There must be a cause, a push, a pull, a force of some kind, that brought about the transition from rest to motion. The water was cold, and then it became hot. There must be a cause, the application of heat from some source that produced the change. This is what the law of causality says. It says nothing about why anything exists in the first place. That is a different question entirely, and one that, as I will argue later, the law of causality is not equipped to answer, despite the persistent attempts of metaphysicians to use it for that purpose. Now, I need to say more precisely what I mean by a complete empirical representation, because the precision of this concept is essential to everything that follows. A complete empirical representation is a perception, a direct, immediate awareness of an object in space and time. It is not a concept, not an abstract thought, not a memory or an image. It is the direct apprehension of a present, concrete, individual thing. When I look at this table in front of me and see it, not think about it, not remember it, not form an abstract concept of it, but actually see it, right now, that seeing is a complete empirical representation. What makes it complete? What distinguishes a genuine perception from a mere sensation? This is a question of the greatest philosophical importance, and one that has been handled very badly by almost everyone who has addressed it. A mere sensation is a raw datum of the senses, a patch of color, a sound, a feeling of pressure. In itself, a A sensation is subjective through and through. It is a state of the sense organ, a modification of the body. It has no spatial extension beyond the surface of the sense organ itself. It refers to nothing beyond itself. It is just a feeling. A complete perception, a full empirical representation of an object, is something entirely different. When I see the table, I am not just having a sensation of a certain kind in my eyes. I am perceiving an object that is out there in space, at a certain distance from me, with a certain size and shape, with surfaces that face in various directions, with a solidity and resistance that I attribute to it, even though I am not currently touching it. All of this, the externality, the spatial extension, the three-dimensionality, the causal efficacy, is not contained in the raw sensation. It is added by the understanding. This is the crucial point. Perception is not passive reception of data. It is an active intellectual construction. The understanding takes the raw material of sensation and transforms it into the perception of an objective, external, causally efficacious thing. And the tool it uses to make this transformation is precisely the concept of causality, the law of cause and effect. Here is how it works. The sensation in my eye is an effect. The understanding automatically and immediately infers from this effect to its cause, to something out there in the world that produced this sensation by acting on my sense organ. The external object is posited as the cause of the internal sensation. And it is posited not as a bare cause, not as a mere something that produced this effect, but as a cause with specific spatial properties, properties that are determined by the precise character of the sensation and by the known structure of the sense organ and the laws of physics governing light, sound, pressure, and so on. This inference from sensation to external object is not a conscious inference. It does not happen slowly and laboriously, step by step, the way a logical argument is worked through. It happens instantaneously, automatically, below the level of conscious reflection. It is an operation of the understanding, not of reason in Kant's sense, not of abstract conceptual thought, but of the understanding as the faculty of causal inference, operating directly on the raw data of sensation. This is what I mean when I say that perception is intellectual, not that it involves abstract thought, it does not, but it involves the understanding, the faculty of causality, and is therefore an active construction, not a passive reception. The great majority of philosophers have missed this entirely. The empiricists, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, treated sensation and perception as if they were essentially the same thing, differing only in degree of vividness. They never asked seriously enough how the transition from a subjective sensation in a sense organ to the perception of an objective external thing is actually accomplished. Berkeley came closest to seeing the problem. His whole philosophy is animated by the puzzle of how we get from subjective impressions to the knowledge of an external world. But his solution, that there is no external material world, only minds and their ideas, with God ensuring the regularity of our experience, simply dissolves the problem rather than solving it. Kant saw more clearly that perception involves an active contribution from the mind. His transcendental aesthetic establishes that space and time are forms of intuition contributed by the subject, not features read off from mind-independent reality. His analytic establishes that the categories, including causality, are forms contributed by the understanding. But Kant located this intellectual contribution at the level of abstract conceptual thought, at the level of the pure concepts of the understanding applied in judgment. He did not see clearly enough that the intellectual contribution of the understanding occurs already at the level of perception itself, before any abstract judgment is formed, before any concept is consciously applied. This is the point I want to insist on. The understanding is at work in perception, in direct, immediate, pre-conceptual perception. When I see the table, the understanding has already done its work before I form any judgment about it, before I apply any concept to it, before I think any thought about it at all. The perception itself, the direct seeing, is already an intellectual achievement. It is already the product of causal inference, even though that inference happens below the threshold of consciousness. The evidence for this is overwhelming, and I will present it in detail in the next section. For now, let me simply state the conclusion. What we call the external world, the world of objects in space and time, is not given to us directly in sensation. It is constructed by the understanding from the raw material of sensation, using the law of causality as its instrument. The principle of sufficient reason of becoming, the law that every change has a cause, is not just a law we apply after the fact, to explain events we have already perceived. It is the law by which we constitute perception itself. It is the condition of the possibility of there being a perceived world at all. Section 20. Proof that perception is intellectual. Evidence from experience. The claim I made at the end of the last section, that perception is an intellectual act, a construction of the understanding using the law of causality, is not a mere philosophical speculation. It is confirmed by a wide range of concrete evidence drawn from everyday experience and from scientific observation. Let me go through the most important of these. The evidence from the senses themselves. Consider first how little of what we actually perceive is contained in the raw sensation. When I look at a sphere, a ball, say, what my retina actually receives is a flat, roughly circular patch of color, shading from lighter in the center to darker at the edges. There is no depth in the retinal image. There is no three-dimensionality. There is no solidity. There is no sphere. All of that, the roundness, the depth, the solidity, the fact that the object curves away from me on all sides, is added by the understanding. The understanding takes the flat, two-dimensional pattern of light and shade on the retina and infers from it, instantly and automatically, the existence of a three-dimensional object with a curved surface, an object that would feel round if I touched it, that would roll if I pushed it, that has a backside I cannot currently see. None of this is in the sensation. All of it is the understanding's contribution. The same is true of distance. When I see an object across the room, I perceive it as being at a certain distance from me. But distance is not something the eye can directly sense. The retina is a flat surface. It registers directions, not distances. The perception of distance is always a construction, an inference from cues such as the size of the retinal image, the degree of convergence of the two eyes, the overlap of objects in the visual field, the gradient of texture across surfaces, and so on. The understanding uses these cues to infer distance, and does so rapidly and automatically that the result feels like direct perception rather than inference. The evidence from people born blind who gain sight. One of the most striking confirmations of the intellectual nature of perception comes from documented cases of people who were born blind, or who lost their sight very early in life, and later had their sight restored through surgery. These cases were first collected and analyzed by the surgeon William Cheselden in the early 18th century, studied by many investigators since. What these cases consistently show is this. When sight is first restored to someone who has been blind from birth, they do not immediately perceive a three-dimensional world of objects in space. They see, in the sense that light now reaches their retinas and produces sensations, but they cannot make sense of what they see. They cannot judge distances. They cannot distinguish a sphere from a flat circle. They reach out to touch objects that are many feet away, thinking they are within arm's reach. They are overwhelmed and disoriented. Everything looks flat and chaotic. Only gradually, over days and weeks, Do they learn to interpret visual sensations correctly, to use them as the basis for inferences about the spatial properties of objects? And this learning process is clearly an intellectual process. They are learning to apply the law of causality, learning to infer from the character of the visual sensation to the spatial properties of its cause. The fact that this learning takes time, that it does not happen automatically the moment light first reaches the retina, shows conclusively that the three-dimensional world of objects is not given in sensation itself. It is constructed by the understanding, and the understanding must learn how to do this construction correctly. This is one of the most important pieces of empirical evidence in all of the theory of perception. It shows, as nothing else can, that seeing a world of objects is not the same as having sensations. It is an intellectual achievement that builds on sensation, but goes far beyond it. The evidence from the other senses. What is true of vision is equally true of the other senses, though it is less obvious because we are so thoroughly habituated to the intellectual constructions involved that they feel like direct perception. Consider hearing. When I hear a sound, I do not just have an auditory sensation, a certain quality and intensity of sound in my ears. I immediately perceive the sound as coming from a source, from somewhere out there in space, at a certain distance and in a certain direction. But the auditory sensation itself contains no information about location. The location is inferred from differences in the timing and intensity of the sound as it reaches the two ears, from the quality of reflections and echoes, from prior experience with the kinds of sounds that tend to come from certain kinds of sources. The understanding performs all of this inference automatically, and the result is the perception of a sound coming from a specific location in the external world. Consider touch. When I press my finger against this table, I feel resistance. But the sensation of resistance, of pressure against the skin, does not in itself tell me that there is a solid object out there. The transition from the sensation of pressure to the perception of a solid external object is again an inference of the understanding, an inference from the effect produced in my sense organ to the cause that produced it. The evidence from double vision and related phenomena. When I press gently on one eyeball from the side, I see double. I perceive two images of whatever I am looking at, but I do not perceive two objects. I know perfectly well that there is only one object. The understanding overrides the doubled sensation with its knowledge that the doubling is caused by an artificial displacement of one eye, not by the presence of two objects. This shows that the understanding is actively interpreting the sensations, not just passively registering them. It filters and corrects the raw sensory data in light of its knowledge of causes. Similarly, when I cross my eyes deliberately, the visual field doubles. But again, I do not perceive two separate worlds. I perceive one world seen double. The understanding maintains its grip on the causal structure of the situation even when the raw sensations are distorted. The evidence from habitual misperception. Consider the well-known phenomenon of the stick that appears bent when partially submerged in water. I see the stick as bent, but I know it is straight. I can reach in and feel that it is straight, or I can pull it out and see that it is straight. The visual appearance of bending persists even after I know perfectly well that the stick is straight. Why? Because the visual appearance is produced automatically by the understanding's application of the normal laws of light propagation, laws that do not account for the refraction that occurs at the water's surface. The understanding is applying the right law in the wrong circumstances, and the result is a systematic misperception. This shows two things. First, perception is indeed the result of the understanding applying causal laws to sensory data, because when those laws are misapplied, the result is a systematic perceptual error, not just a random confusion. Second, The understanding's perceptual constructions are not under the control of abstract conscious thought, because knowing that the stick is straight does not make it look straight. The intellectual operation that produces perception runs at a level below conscious reasoning and is not corrected by it. The evidence from the newborn. A newborn infant does not perceive a world of objects. It has sensations of light, of sound, of touch, of warmth and cold, of hunger and satiation. But it does not yet organize these sensations into a coherent world of external objects persisting through time. This organization develops gradually over the first months of life, as the infant's understanding learns to apply the law of causality to its sensory experience, learns to infer from sensations to their causes, to track objects through space, to anticipate the effects of its own actions on the external world. The developmental trajectory from raw sensation to organized perception is itself the clearest possible demonstration that perception is an intellectual achievement, that it is something the mind does with sensation, not something that is directly given in sensation. The conclusion. All of this evidence converges on a single conclusion. The world of objects that we perceive, the familiar world of tables and chairs, of trees and stones, of other people and their actions, is not given to us directly in sensation. It is constructed by the understanding from the raw material of sensation, using the law of causality as its primary tool. The understanding takes the effect, the sensation in the sense organ, and infers from it to the cause, the external object with its spatial properties and causal powers. This is what I mean by the intellectual nature of empirical perception. And this is why the principle of sufficient reason of becoming, the law of causality, is not just one principle among others that we apply to an already given world. It is the principle by which the world is given to us in the first place. It is the condition of the possibility of there being a perceived world at all. With this established, I can now move on to examine the law of causality itself in more detail, its precise scope, its limits, and the ways in which it has been misunderstood and misapplied throughout the history of philosophy. Section 22. More precise determination of the law of causality. Now I need to pin down the law of causality with greater precision, to say exactly what it does and does not assert, and to clear away several persistent misunderstandings that have attached themselves to it like barnacles. The law applies to states, not to substances. The first and most important clarification is this. The law of causality governs states, the particular conditions of things at particular moments in time. It does not govern substances, the things themselves considered as persisting entities. Matter, as such, is never caused and never destroyed. It simply persists. What changes, what is caused, and what requires a cause is the state of matter at any given moment. The arrangement, the motion, the temperature, the chemical composition, the form. These change, and every change requires a cause. But the underlying matter that bears these states neither comes into being nor passes away. It is permanent. This is the principle of the conservation of matter, a principle that even common sense grasps instinctively. When wood burns, we do not think the wood has been annihilated. We think it has been transformed. Its state has changed, its chemical composition has changed, its form has changed, but the matter itself persists in the smoke, the ash, the gases released into the air. The cause, the fire, produced a change of state. It did not produce or destroy the substance itself. This means that when someone asks, what caused this thing to exist? What caused this table, this mountain, this person? They are already asking the wrong question, or rather a question that needs to be rephrased before the law of causality can be applied to it. The law of causality does not explain why anything exists, why there is matter rather than nothing, why the world exists rather than not. It explains why things are in the states they are in, why the matter that makes up this table is arranged in this particular form, why this mountain has this particular shape, why this person has this particular character and history. These are questions about states, and to these questions, the law of causality does give an answer, in principle, if not always in practice. The confusion between the origin of states and the origin of substances is one of the deepest sources of philosophical error. It is this confusion that makes the cosmological argument for God's existence seem compelling. The argument takes the existence of the world, which looks like the existence of a substance, and asks for its cause. But existence is not a state. The law of causality does not apply. The argument is built on a category error. Cause and effect are always simultaneous. Here is a point that will surprise many readers, but which follows with strict necessity from the correct understanding of causality. The cause and the effect are always simultaneous. There is no gap in time between the cause and the effect. The moment the cause is fully operative, the moment all the conditions for the effect are in place, the effect is already present. Causality is instantaneous. This seems to contradict common sense. We naturally think of causes as preceding their effects. The hammer strikes first, and then the nail moves. But think more carefully. When does the cause become fully operative? The hammer acts on the nail throughout the duration of their contact. During that contact, at every instant of it, the nail is already responding. The response, the motion of the nail, does not wait for the cause to finish and then begin. It occurs simultaneously with the application of the cause. At every moment during the hammer's strike, the nail is already moving. Cause and effect are simultaneous at each instant. What precedes the effect is not the cause itself, but the conditions that led up to the cause becoming fully operative. Before the hammer struck, certain things happened. The arm swung, the muscles contracted, the decision was made. But these are not the cause of the nail's movement. They are causes of the hammer's striking, which is itself the cause of the nail's movement. Each link in the causal chain is simultaneous with its immediate effect. The appearance of temporal gap between distant links in a causal chain is due to the fact that there are many intermediate links, not to any genuine delay between cause and effect. Kant made this point implicitly, but never stated it with full clarity. I state it explicitly because it has important consequences. It means that the relationship between cause and effect is not a relationship between two events separated in time. It is a relationship between two aspects of a single moment, the state of the cause at a given instant and the state of the effect at that same instant. Causality is a synchronic relationship, not a diachronic one. It governs what is happening now, how the current state of things follows necessarily from the current state of causes, not what happened before and what happened after. The cause is always a change, not a permanent state. Another important clarification: the cause of any change is always itself a change, never a permanent, unvarying state. Consider a stone lying on a table. The table has been supporting the stone for years. Why does the stone not fall through the table now? The answer is, the table's resistance is the cause of the stone remaining where it is, and the table's resistance is not a permanent feature of the situation, but something that must be actively maintained at every moment by the table's structural integrity. If the table's resistance were to change, if a leg were to break, if the tabletop were to crack, the stone would fall. But now consider, if the cause were simply the permanent state of the table supporting the stone, then nothing would ever change. A permanent state cannot produce a change, because it is by definition the same at every moment, and therefore cannot explain why a change occurs at this moment rather than at any other. Only a change in the state of causes can explain a change in the state of effects. This means that what we identify as the cause of any given change is always some change in the prior conditions. not a persisting state. When the stone falls from the table, the cause is not simply the stone's weight. The stone has always had that weight. The cause is the breaking of the table leg, or the removal of the table, the change in the conditions that were previously maintaining the stone's position. It is the change in the supporting conditions, not the unchanging weight, that is the cause of the fall. This is a seemingly simple point, but it has profound implications. It means that causality is always about the dynamics of change, about how one change leads to another, and never about the existence of stable states as such. Stable states require explanation too. They require the ongoing operation of causes that maintain them. But the explanation of a stable state is different in kind from the explanation of a change. What the law of causality does not explain. I have said that the law of causality does not explain why matter exists, or why the world exists. But there is another thing it does not explain that is equally important. It does not explain the specific qualities of things, the intrinsic natures that determine how things respond to causes. When fire heats water, the cause is the application of thermal energy. The effect is the rise in temperature of the water. The law of causality tells us that this effect follows necessarily from this cause, given the nature of water. But the law of causality does not explain the nature of water. Why water, specifically, responds to heat by warming rather than by doing something else entirely. Why it boils at 100 degrees rather than at some other temperature. Why it expands when it freezes rather than contracting. These specific natures, the intrinsic properties of things that determine how they respond to causes, are simply given. They are what they are. The law of causality takes them as its starting point and tells us how things with these natures behave when acted upon by various causes. But it cannot itself account for the natures. The natures are, in the language of the old philosophers, occult qualities. Not in the pejorative sense of being mysterious or unknowable, but in the straightforward sense of being the given, irreducible basis of all causal explanation. Physics and chemistry discover and describe these natures. They tell us how water behaves, how iron behaves, how gases behave. But they do not explain why these things have the natures they have. That question points beyond the reach of natural science altogether. It points toward the inner nature of things, toward what things are in themselves rather than in their causal relations to other things. And my answer to that question, the answer given in my chief work, is that the inner nature of everything is will. But that, again, is a different investigation from this one. The principle of the complete determination of the cause. One last point deserves emphasis. For the law of causality to operate, for the effect to follow necessarily from the cause must be complete. Every single condition that is required for the effect must be present. If even one required condition is absent, the effect will not follow. This is what philosophers call the principle of the sufficient cause, as opposed to a merely necessary cause. A necessary cause is one that is required for the effect, but not sufficient by itself to produce it. A sufficient cause is the complete set of all conditions that together are necessary and sufficient for the effect to occur. It is only the sufficient cause, the complete cause, that makes the effect necessary. In practice, we rarely state the complete cause. We pick out the most recently changed condition, the one that tipped the balance, so to speak, and call that the cause. When the nail moves because the hammer strikes it, we say the hammer stroke is the cause. But strictly speaking, the cause includes everything that was required for the nail to move. The hammer, its mass and velocity. The nail, its material and position. The wood beneath, the absence of counteracting forces, and so on. All of these conditions together constitute the complete cause. and it is only the complete cause that entails the effect with strict necessity. This is why the law of causality, precisely stated, says, every change has a sufficient cause, a complete set of prior conditions from which it follows necessarily. Not every change has a cause in the loose, everyday sense of having something that contributed to it. Every change has a complete, sufficient cause, a set of conditions that, taken together, make it impossible for the effect not to occur. With this precise understanding of the law of causality in place, I can now turn to the second class of objects, and the second form of the principle of sufficient reason, the logical form, which governs the domain of abstract concepts and judgments. Section 23. Transition to the second class of objects, abstract representations. The first class of objects, complete empirical representations, the objects of direct perception in space and time, is governed by the principle of sufficient reason of becoming, which is the law of causality. I have now examined this form of the principle in sufficient detail. It is time to turn to the second class of objects and the second form of the principle. The second class of objects consists of abstract representations. These are concepts, representations of representations. They are not perceptions of individual things in space and time, but general ideas that capture what is common to many individual things. The concept of a tree is not any particular tree that I see or touch. It is an abstraction drawn from many experiences of many individual trees, a general representation that applies to all of them while being identical with none of them. This distinction between perception and concept, between the concrete individual and the abstract general, is one of the most fundamental in all of philosophy. And it is one that has been handled with astonishing carelessness by many philosophers, including some of the greatest. The rationalists, Descartes, Leibniz, Wolff, tended to privilege abstract concepts over concrete perceptions. For them, genuine knowledge was conceptual knowledge, knowledge derived by reason from clear and distinct ideas. Perceptual knowledge was confused and unreliable, a mere appearance that stood in the way of true understanding. The real world, on this view, was the world of rational concepts and necessary truths. The world as reason constructs it. The perceived world was a pale and misleading shadow of this rational reality. The empiricists took the opposite view. For them, all genuine knowledge derives ultimately from perception, from the direct experience of individual things in space and time. Concepts are just general names, labels we attach to groups of similar perceptions for convenience. They have no independent existence and no cognitive content beyond what they derive from the perceptions they summarize. Both of these extreme positions are wrong, and wrong in ways that are mirror images of each other. The rationalists overvalue the abstract at the expense of the concrete. The empiricists overvalue the concrete at the expense of the abstract. The truth requires holding both together, recognizing that perception and conception are distinct, that each has its own irreplaceable cognitive role, and that genuine knowledge requires both working in tandem. What perception gives us is this: immediate, direct acquaintance with the individual, the concrete, the particular. Perception is always of this tree, this face, this shade of red, this sound. It is always here and now, always anchored in the present moment of experience. It is inexhaustibly rich in content. The perceived world contains more detail, more nuance, more complexity than any concept or system of concepts could ever capture. And it is certain in its own domain. What I directly perceive is given to me with an immediacy and a vividness that no abstract argument can match. But perception has severe limitations as a vehicle of knowledge. It is always particular. It gives me this tree, but not trees in general. It is always present. It anchors me to the here and now and gives me no direct access to the past or the future. It is always individual. It presents things one at a time and gives me no way to grasp the general laws and patterns that govern them. And it is incommunicable directly. I cannot share my perception with you. I can only describe it in words, and words are abstract concepts. This is where abstract representation, conceptual thought, becomes indispensable. Concepts allow us to go beyond the individual and the present. They allow us to grasp what is general and common across many individual cases. They allow us to formulate laws, general truths that apply not just to this case, but to all cases of this kind. They allow us to reason, to derive consequences from premises, to build systems of knowledge, to make predictions and explanations. And they allow us to communicate, to share our knowledge with others through language, to accumulate knowledge across generations, to build the collective intellectual achievement we call science. The price of this power is abstraction, the leaving behind of the rich particularity of the perceived world. Every concept is thinner and poorer in content than the perceptions from which it is drawn. The concept of a tree captures what is common to all trees, but misses everything that is specific to any particular tree: its exact shape, its precise shade of green, the particular quality of the sound its leaves make in this specific breeze. The concept purchases generality and communicability at the cost of concreteness and richness. This is not a defect of concepts, it is their nature and their virtue. The abstraction is precisely what makes concepts useful. A concept that captured every detail of every individual tree would be useless for the purposes of scientific knowledge. It would be just as complex and unwieldy as reality itself, and would give us no purchase on reality's general structure. The simplification, the leaving behind of particulars, is what allows concepts to illuminate the general patterns that individual perceptions, taken one at a time, cannot reveal. Section 24. The nature of concepts. What exactly is a concept? Let me be as precise as possible. A concept is a representation that is derived from other representations by a process of abstraction. It is produced by attending to what is common across a range of representations, whether perceptions or other concepts, and setting aside what is particular to each individual case. The result is a general representation that applies to all the cases from which it was abstracted, while being identical with none of them. Concepts are representations of representations. This is their defining characteristic. They do not represent the world directly, the way perceptions do. They represent the world indirectly, by representing representations of the world. A perception of a tree relates directly to this tree. It is this tree as it appears to me right now. The concept of a tree relates to trees only through the medium of perceptions of trees. It is a representation of what all those individual perceptions have in common. This means that concepts are always parasitic on perception. They have no content of their own beyond what they derive from perception. A concept that was not grounded in any perception, that did not ultimately refer back to some possible experience, would be an empty word, a mere sound with no cognitive content. This is one of Kant's most important insights, and I fully endorse it. Concepts without intuitions are empty. Perceptions without concepts are blind. Both are needed, and neither is sufficient alone. Now, concepts stand in relations to one another, relations of subordination and superordination, inclusion and exclusion. The concept of a poodle is subordinate to the concept of a dog, which is subordinate to the concept of a mammal, which is subordinate to the concept of an animal, which is subordinate to the concept of a living thing, which is subordinate to the concept of a material thing, and so on upward to the most general concepts of all. This hierarchical structure is what makes systematic knowledge, science, possible. Science is not just a collection of observations. It is a system of concepts organized into a hierarchy, with the most general principles at the top and the most specific observations at the bottom, connected by relations of logical derivation. And it is precisely this hierarchical, systematic structure, this organization of concepts into a network of grounds and consequences, that the second form of the principle of sufficient reason governs. Section 25, the principle of sufficient reason of knowing. The second form of the principle of sufficient reason, the form that governs the domain of abstract concepts and judgments, is the principle of sufficient reason of knowing. It states, if a judgment is to express genuine knowledge, it must have a sufficient ground. That is, there must be something in virtue of which the judgment is true, something that justifies it, something from which its truth follows. This is the logical form of the principle. It is what we mean when we demand a reason for a claim, when we ask, why do you think that? Or, what is your evidence? Or, how do you know? We are asking for the sufficient ground of the judgment, the thing in virtue of which it is true. Now, what can serve as the sufficient ground of a judgment? There are 4 possible kinds of ground, and they correspond to 4 different sources of justification for our claims. The first kind of ground is another judgment. A judgment can be grounded in a prior judgment from which it follows logically. This is the structure of logical inference, of proof and demonstration. If I know that all humans are mortal and that Socrates is human, then the judgment Socrates is mortal has its ground in these 2 prior judgments. Its truth follows necessarily from theirs. This is what Aristotle called a syllogism, and it is the basic structure of all deductive reasoning. But notice that this kind of grounding can never be the ultimate ground of any judgment. If a judgment is grounded in prior judgments, those prior judgments must themselves be grounded in something, either in still further judgments, or in something that is not itself a judgment. An infinite regress of judgments, grounding judgments, is not a genuine foundation for knowledge. At some point, the chain of logical inference must bottom out in something that is not itself derived from a prior judgment. What is that something? The second kind of ground is empirical experience, direct perception. Many of our judgments are grounded not in prior judgments, but in what we directly perceive. This table is brown is grounded not in a logical inference from other judgments, but in the direct perception of the table's color. Perceptual judgments, judgments that express or describe what is directly perceived, have their ground in perception itself. And perception, unlike abstract judgment, does not require a further ground of the same kind. It is self-justifying in its own domain. I know this table is brown because I see it. The seeing is the ground. No further justification is needed or possible. The third kind of ground is pure a priori intuition, the forms of space and time as grasped in pure intuition, independent of any particular empirical experience. This is the ground of mathematical truths. The judgment that the angles of a triangle sum to 2 right angles is grounded not in empirical observation of particular triangles, not in any specific perception, but in the pure intuition of space, in the structure of space, as we can grasp it independently of experience. This is what makes mathematical knowledge both a priori, independent of experience, and genuinely informative, not reducible to mere logical analysis of concepts. The fourth kind of ground is what Kant called formal, ground that lies in the pure forms of thought themselves, independent of any particular content. The laws of logic, the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, are grounded in this way. They do not derive their truth from experience or from pure intuition. They express the most basic conditions of coherent thought as such. Any judgment that violates these laws is not merely false, but incoherent. It cannot even be consistently thought. These 4 kinds of ground correspond to 4 different sources of knowledge: logical inference, empirical perception, pure intuition, and the formal conditions of thought. And a judgment can have its sufficient ground in any one of these sources, or in a combination of them. What the principle of sufficient reason of knowing demands is simply this: that every genuine cognitive judgment have some sufficient ground of one of these kinds. A judgment that has no ground at all, that rests on nothing, that cannot be justified by any inference, any perception, any intuition, or any formal necessity, is not a piece of knowledge. It is a mere opinion, a prejudice, an arbitrary assertion. The principle of sufficient reason of knowing is what separates knowledge from mere opinion, what distinguishes the justified from the unjustified, the grounded from the groundless. This is why the principle of sufficient reason in its logical form is the foundation of all science. Science is systematic knowledge, knowledge organized into a hierarchy of grounds and consequences, where every claim is justified by reference to something more fundamental. The demand for justification, for a sufficient ground, is the demand that drives scientific inquiry forward and that separates genuine knowledge from mere belief. Section 26. The four subclasses of the ground of knowing. In the previous section, I identified four kinds of ground that can justify a judgment. Now, I need to go through each of these more carefully and precisely, because the distinctions between them are of great importance and have often been blurred. The first subclass, logical ground. The first kind of sufficient ground for a judgment is another judgment, or set of judgments, from which the first follows by logical necessity. This is formal logical truth. A judgment has formal logical truth when it follows necessarily from other judgments that are already accepted as true. The connection between the grounding judgments and the grounded judgment is purely formal. It depends only on the logical structure of the judgments, not on their specific content. The clearest example is the syllogism. All humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. The conclusion is grounded in the premises. Given the premises, the conclusion cannot be denied without contradiction. The ground of the conclusion is entirely logical. It lies in the formal relationship between the premises and the conclusion, not in any empirical fact or mathematical intuition. Now, formal logical truth is a genuine kind of truth, and the logical relationships that ground it are genuine relationships. But it is important to understand what formal logical truth does and does not give us. What it gives us is this: if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. The truth is transmitted from premises to conclusion with necessity. What it does not give us is any guarantee that the premises themselves are true. The entire system of logical inference is, so to speak, conditional. It tells us what follows from what, but it does not tell us where to start, what to take as given, what to accept as the ultimate basis of knowledge. This is why purely formal logical truth, logical derivation from premises, can never be the complete story of human knowledge. At some point, we must arrive at judgments that are not themselves derived from prior judgments, judgments that are grounded in something other than logical inference. The other three subclasses of the ground of knowing provide these ultimate foundations. The second subclass, empirical ground. The second kind of sufficient ground for a judgment is direct empirical experience, perception. A judgment has empirical truth when it is grounded in, when it correctly expresses or describes what is directly perceived. When I look at the sky and say, "The sky is blue," this judgment is grounded in my direct perception of the sky's color. The ground is not another judgment, it is a perception. And the perception is, within its own domain, self-justifying. It does not require a further ground of the same kind. I know the sky is blue because I see it. The seeing is the ground. This kind of ground is the most important and most fundamental of all, because ultimately all knowledge, however abstract and however thoroughly organized into logical systems, must bottom out in empirical ground. Concepts without perceptual grounding are empty. A system of judgments that floated entirely free of any connection to possible experience would be an elaborate fiction, a coherent fantasy, perhaps, but not knowledge of the real world. The empirical ground is also the most immediately certain kind of ground, in its own domain, which is the domain of the currently perceived, the here and now. When I directly perceive something, that perception carries a certainty that no abstract argument can match or undermine. Descartes' method of systematic doubt could call into question the existence of the external world, the reliability of memory, the truth of mathematics, but it could not call into question the immediate contents of current experience. Whatever else I might doubt, I cannot doubt that I am now having this experience. But empirical ground also has a limitation that logical ground does not share. Logical ground is universal. If the inference from these premises to this conclusion is valid, it is valid for everyone at all times, and could not be otherwise. Empirical ground is particular. It is the ground for this judgment, made by this person, at this time, in these circumstances. The perception that grounds my judgment, the sky is blue, is my perception. It is not directly accessible to anyone else, and it was had at a particular time and place that will not recur. Empirical truth is therefore always truth about the particular and the contingent, about how things happen to be, not about how they must be. This is why science cannot rest on empirical ground alone. Science seeks universal and necessary truths, laws that hold not just here and now, but everywhere and always. To get from particular empirical observations to universal scientific laws, we need the other kinds of ground as well, particularly the formal organization provided by logical inference and the mathematical structure provided by pure intuition. The third subclass, transcendental ground. The third kind of sufficient ground for a judgment is what I call transcendental ground, ground that lies in the conditions of possible experience that the mind brings to experience a priori. This is the most philosophically important and the most difficult of the four subclasses to grasp clearly. Let me try to explain it as directly as possible. There are certain judgments that are neither empirical, not grounded in any particular perception, nor purely logical, not derivable by formal inference from other judgments, and yet are not arbitrary or groundless. They are grounded in the conditions that must be in place for experience to be possible at all, conditions that the mind contributes to experience rather than reading off from it. The clearest examples are the judgments that express the pure forms of experience, space, time, and causality. The judgment that every event has a cause is not derived from any particular empirical observation. No finite amount of observational evidence could establish a universal necessary law. And it is not a purely logical truth. Its denial is not a logical contradiction in the formal sense. Yet it is not merely an empirical generalization that might turn out to be false. It is a condition of the possibility of experience, something that must hold if there is to be a coherent experience of an objective world at all. Similarly for the basic truths of geometry. The judgment that a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points is not derived from measuring particular straight lines and comparing them to curved paths. It is grounded in the pure intuition of space, in the structure of space as the mind contributes it to experience. This ground is transcendental. It lies not in any particular experience, but in the conditions of all possible experience. Kant's critique of pure reason is largely devoted to identifying and systematizing the transcendental grounds of our most fundamental judgments. His transcendental aesthetic identifies the pure forms of intuition, space, and time as transcendental grounds for mathematical knowledge. His transcendental analytic identifies the pure concepts of the understanding, the categories, including causality, as transcendental grounds for the basic structural features of our experience of an objective world. I accept Kant's fundamental insight here, while disagreeing with some of the details of his execution. In particular, I think Kant located the transcendental contribution of the understanding at the wrong level, at the level of abstract judgment rather than at the level of perception itself. As I argued in the previous chapter, the understanding is already at work in perception, already applying the law of causality to sensory data to construct the perception of an objective external world before any abstract judgment is formed. The transcendental ground operates at the pre-conceptual level of perception, not only at the level of conceptual judgment. The fourth subclass, metalogical ground. The fourth and final kind of sufficient ground for a judgment is what I call metalogical ground, ground that lies in the formal conditions of thought as such, the laws without which coherent thinking is impossible. These are the laws of logic in the deepest sense, not the specific rules of valid inference, but the most fundamental conditions of consistent thought. There are four of them. The first is the law of identity. A concept is identical with itself. A is A. Whatever is what it is. This seems trivially obvious, and it is obvious, which is precisely the point. It is obvious because it is a condition of thought as such. Any attempt to think otherwise collapses into incoherence. The second is the law of non-contradiction. No predicate can both apply and not apply to the same subject at the same time and in the same respect. A cannot be both B and not B simultaneously. This is the most fundamental law of consistent thought. A judgment that violates it is not merely false. It is not even a genuine judgment at all. It is a noise that mimics the form of a judgment without having any content. The third is the law of excluded middle. For any subject and any predicate, either the predicate applies or it does not. There is no middle ground. Either A is B or A is not B. There is no third option. The fourth is the principle of sufficient reason of knowing itself, the principle that every true judgment must have a ground. This is the metalogical form of our principle, the form in which the principle of sufficient reason of knowing applies to itself, as a condition of thought as such, rather than as a specific demand for empirical or logical justification. These four metalogical laws are the most fundamental grounds of all, more fundamental even than logical inference, because logical inference itself presupposes them. They are not derived from anything more basic. They are simply the conditions without which thinking is impossible, the bedrock on which all knowledge rests. Now, it might seem circular to include the principle of sufficient reason among the metalogical grounds that justify judgments, since the principle of sufficient reason is precisely what we are trying to explain and justify in this book. But there is no genuine circularity here. What I am saying is not that the principle of sufficient reason justifies itself. That would be circular. What I am saying is that the demand for a ground is itself a condition of coherent thought, that thinking which did not recognize the distinction between grounded and groundless judgments would not be genuine thinking at all. The principle is not proved by being listed among the metalogical laws. It is recognized as a condition of thought by reflection on what thought requires. This recognition is itself the closest we can come to a justification of the principle, not a proof from something more fundamental, since there is nothing more fundamental, but an acknowledgement that the principle is built into the very structure of rational thought. To demand a justification for the principle of sufficient reason that goes beyond this acknowledgement is to misunderstand the nature of the principle. It is to ask, why should thought be rational? And to that question there is no answer, not because the question is deep and difficult, but because it is incoherent. Thought that abandoned the demand for grounds would not be free and unconstrained thought. It would not be thought at all. Section 27. The relationship between ground of knowing and ground of becoming. Now, I need to address a confusion that has caused more damage to philosophy than almost any other, a confusion I have already touched on several times in discussing the history of the principle, but which deserves its own direct treatment. The confusion is this: conflating the ground of knowing with the ground of becoming. Treating the logical reason, the premise from which a conclusion follows, as if it were the same thing as the physical cause, the prior state from which a subsequent state necessarily follows. Using the word reason or ground indiscriminately for both, without noticing that these are fundamentally different relationships belonging to fundamentally different domains. Let me state the difference as sharply as possible. The ground of becoming, the cause, is a relationship between real events in the physical world. It is a relationship between states of things in space and time. The cause is a prior state. The effect is a subsequent state. The relationship is real. It exists in the world, not in our thinking about the world. When the hammer strikes the nail and the nail moves, the hammer's striking is really, in the world, the cause of the nail's moving. This causal relationship would hold even if no one ever thought about it, described it, or formed any judgment about it. It is a feature of reality, not of knowledge. The ground of knowing, the logical reason, is a relationship between judgments. It is a relationship between abstractions, between representations of representations. The premise is a judgment. The conclusion is a judgment. The relationship between them is logical. It exists in the domain of thought and language, not in the domain of physical events. When I argue from all humans are mortal and Socrates is human to Socrates is mortal, the premises are not causing the conclusion in any physical sense. They are logically grounding it, providing a justification for accepting it, a reason for judging it to be true. These two relationships, causal and logical, are utterly different in kind. They belong to different domains. They operate by different mechanisms. They carry different implications. Yet they have been confused with each other, persistently and disastrously, throughout the history of philosophy. And the confusion always runs in the same direction. The logical relationship is mistaken for or substituted for the causal relationship. Philosophers take what is in reality a logical connection, a connection between concepts or judgments, and treat it as if it were a real causal connection between things or events. The most important and most damaging instance of this confusion is the one I have already discussed at length: the ontological proof of God's existence. The proof takes the logical relationship between the concept of God and the predicate of existence, the fact that existence is analytically contained in or logically derivable from our concept of a supremely perfect being, and treats this logical relationship as if it established a real causal or constitutive connection between the concept and the actual existence of the thing it represents. It moves from the logical to the real, from the order of knowledge to the order of being, without any justification for making that move. Kant's refutation of the ontological proof consists precisely in identifying this confusion and refusing to make the move. Existence, Kant argues, is not a predicate. It is not a property that can be logically included in or excluded from a concept. The concept of a supremely perfect being, however carefully defined, cannot logically entail the actual existence of such a being, because logical entailment is a relationship between concepts, while actual existence is a matter of whether anything in reality corresponds to the concept. These are entirely different questions. No logical analysis of a concept, however thorough, can tell us whether anything in reality instantiates it. That is an empirical question, a question to be settled by experience, not by conceptual analysis. This is one of the great moments in the history of philosophy, and yet the confusion Kant identified has proved remarkably persistent. It keeps resurfacing in different forms, under different names, in different philosophical systems. It appears in Spinoza, as I showed earlier, in the way he runs together reason or cause, treating the logical derivability of attributes from the concept of substance as if it were a real causal relationship between God and the world. It appears in Schelling and Hegel, in the attempt to derive the structure of reality from the self-development of concepts, as if the logical movement from one concept to another were the same as or directly revelatory of the real movement of things in the world. For Hegel in particular, the dialectical development of the concept, the logical movement from thesis to antithesis to synthesis, is supposed to be identical with or directly constitutive of the actual historical development of reality. This is the confusion of logical and causal ground elevated to an absolute metaphysical principle. It is the error Kant identified and corrected, taken and made the foundation of an entire philosophical system. And it appears, more subtly, in the ordinary philosophical practice of treating conceptual analysis as if it were a form of causal explanation, as if showing that a concept logically entails another concept were the same as showing how the thing, the first concept applies to produces the thing the second concept applies to. This conflation is endemic in philosophy and is the source of endless pseudo-explanations, explanations that satisfy the demand for a logical ground while leaving the demand for a real causal explanation entirely unmet. Let me give a simple example of the difference. I see water turning to ice as the temperature drops. I want to explain this. I want to understand why it happens. There are two completely different kinds of explanation I can seek. The first kind is a logical explanation. I look for the concepts under which this event falls, the laws and principles that it is an instance of. I note that water is a substance with a certain chemical composition, that substances with this composition have a certain freezing point, that when a substance's temperature drops below its freezing point, it transitions from liquid to solid state. I subsume this particular event under these general laws and principles. Now, I have a logical explanation. I have shown that this event is an instance of laws that I already accept. The event follows logically from the relevant facts and laws. The second kind is a causal explanation. I ask, what physical processes actually produced this change? What happened at the molecular level when the temperature dropped? How did the kinetic energy of the water molecules decrease? How did the intermolecular forces that had been insufficient to hold the molecules in fixed positions become sufficient? How did the crystalline structure of ice form and grow? This is an account of the real physical processes that constituted the change, the actual causal mechanism by which the liquid became solid. Both kinds of explanation are legitimate and valuable, but they are not the same kind of thing. The logical explanation subsumes the event under laws. The causal explanation traces the real physical processes. Confusing the two, thinking that the logical subsumption is itself a causal explanation, or that finding a causal mechanism somehow dispenses with the need for logical systematization, is the source of endless confusion in the philosophy of science and in metaphysics. Now, there is an important asymmetry between these two kinds of ground that deserves special attention. In a causal chain, the cause always precedes the effect in time. Causes come before effects. The state of the world at time t is caused by the state of the world at times prior to t, not by the state of the world at times subsequent to t. Causality runs forward in time. In a logical chain, there is no such temporal ordering. Premises do not precede conclusions in time. They precede them only in the order of justification. And crucially, the logical relationship is reversible in a way that the causal relationship is not. From the premises I can derive the conclusion, but I can also, in many cases, reason backward from the conclusion, or from observational evidence to the premises. This is what we do in scientific inference, We observe the evidence and reason back to the hypothesis that best explains it. We infer from effect to cause, from the observed fact to the law or principle that accounts for it. This backward reasoning, from evidence to hypothesis, from observation to law, is often called inference to the best explanation or abductive reasoning. It is perfectly legitimate as a form of reasoning. But it is crucial to notice that when we reason in this direction, from observation to hypothesis, we are moving in the logical order, not the causal order. The observation does not cause the hypothesis. The hypothesis is not an effect of the observation. The relationship is logical. The observation is evidence for the hypothesis, a ground of knowing that the hypothesis is likely true. The causal relationship runs in the opposite direction. The processes described by the hypothesis are the cause of the observations. Keeping these two directions clearly distinguished, the logical order of knowing and the real causal order of being, is one of the most important intellectual habits a philosopher can cultivate. The history of philosophy is largely a record of the damage done when this distinction is ignored. Section 28. Reciprocity of grounds. There is one more topic I need to address before leaving the second form of the principle of sufficient reason, the topic of reciprocal grounds, what the scholastics called convertible terms, and what Kant discussed under the heading of reciprocity. Sometimes two judgments mutually ground each other. Each is the ground of the other, and either can serve as the premise from which the other is derived. For example, this figure is a triangle, and this figure is a plane figure bounded by three straight lines. Each of these judgments is the ground of the other. From the first, I can derive the second. A triangle just is a plane figure bounded by three straight lines. From the second, I can derive the first. A plane figure bounded by three straight lines just is a triangle. The definitions are mutually convertible. Is this a case of circular reasoning? It might seem so. If A grounds B and B grounds A, does each borrow its justification from the other in a vicious circle? The answer is no, and understanding why not is important. The two judgments mutually ground each other, not because each gets its truth from the other, but because both express the same conceptual content in different ways. The relationship between them is not a relationship of epistemic dependence. It is a relationship of conceptual identity. They are two different ways of saying the same thing. The grounding relationship between them is therefore perfectly legitimate. It is not circular in the vicious sense, because neither judgment is more fundamental than the other. They are coordinate expressions of the same underlying concept. This kind of mutual grounding is common in mathematics and in conceptual analysis. Definitions, in particular, typically take this form. The definiendum and the definiens are mutually convertible, each grounding the other, because they express the same content. And this is why definitions, though they look like grounds of knowledge, do not actually add to our knowledge. They make explicit what was already implicit in the concept. They reorganize and clarify our conceptual content without introducing anything new. What is not legitimate is reciprocal grounding between judgments that are not conceptually identical, where each judgment genuinely depends on the other for its truth and neither has any independent foundation. This is the vicious circle, the kind of circular reasoning that philosophers must avoid. If I justify A by appeal to B and then justify B by appeal to A, and neither A nor B has any other ground, then I have justified nothing. I have simply assumed both premises under the guise of deriving each from the other. The distinction between legitimate reciprocal grounding, conceptual identity expressed in two ways, and vicious circular reasoning, mutual dependence without independent foundation, is subtle but crucial. Many philosophical arguments that appear to be viciously circular are in fact cases of legitimate conceptual reciprocity. And many arguments that appear legitimate are in fact viciously circular. Keeping the distinction clear requires careful attention to whether the mutual grounding relationship is one of conceptual identity or one of genuine epistemic dependence. Kant introduced the category of reciprocity, Wechselwirkung, as one of the pure concepts of the understanding, governing a specific form of causal relationship in which cause and effect are mutually dependent. But I think Kant was confused here. Genuine reciprocal causation, in which A causes B and B simultaneously causes A, is impossible in the real causal order, because causality is always sequential, always running forward in time, and two events cannot simultaneously cause each other without a contradiction. What Kant was really pointing to under the heading of reciprocity is not a form of real causation, but a form of logical or conceptual relationship, the mutual dependence of concepts that are correlative, like subject and object, or cause and effect themselves. These are not cases of real reciprocal causation, but of logical reciprocal grounding, and they belong to the second form of the principle of sufficient reason, not the first. This is one more instance of the fundamental confusion between the ground of knowing and the ground of becoming, a confusion that, as I hope these sections have made abundantly clear, runs very deep in the history of philosophy and requires constant vigilance to avoid. Section 29. The third class of objects and the principle of sufficient reason of being. We now arrive at the third class of objects and the third form of the principle of sufficient reason. This form is less frequently discussed than the causal form or the logical form, and it is almost universally confused with one or both of them. Getting it clearly into view requires some care. The third class of objects consists of the pure forms of intuition, space and time considered in themselves, apart from any particular content that fills them. These are the objects of mathematics. Geometry studies space, arithmetic studies time, and the principle of sufficient reason, in its third form, governs mathematical truth. It is the principle that tells us why mathematical propositions are true, what their ground is. I call this third form the principle of sufficient reason of being, the principle of the ground of being. The name is deliberate. In this domain, the ground of a truth is not a cause. No physical process produces mathematical truths. And it is not a logical reason in the sense of a premise from which a conclusion is derived by formal inference. The ground of a mathematical truth is something more immediate and more certain than either of these. It is the direct intuitive insight into the structure of space or time itself. The ground is the way space or time is, the being of these forms of intuition, and it is grasped directly in pure intuition, not derived from anything more fundamental. Let me make this concrete. Consider a simple geometrical truth, the fact that when two straight lines intersect, the opposite angles are equal. This is a theorem of Euclidean geometry. How do we know it is true? What is its ground? One answer is we prove it from the axioms of Euclidean geometry by logical inference. We take the axioms as premises and derive the theorem as a conclusion. This is the standard mathematical procedure, proof by logical deduction from axioms. But this answer, while not wrong, is incomplete, and if taken as the whole story, it is profoundly misleading. It makes mathematical knowledge look like a species of purely logical knowledge, as if mathematical truths were true simply because they follow logically from arbitrarily chosen axioms. On this view, the axioms themselves have no deeper ground. They are simply stipulated, chosen for convenience, and the theorems are just their logical consequences. This view, which has become dominant in modern mathematics, particularly since the development of non-Euclidean geometries and the formalization of mathematics in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, is, in my view, philosophically inadequate. It correctly describes the formal structure of mathematical proof. Theorems do follow from axioms by logical deduction. but it fails to account for the epistemic status of the axioms themselves, for why we accept them as true, for what makes them more than arbitrary stipulations. The answer is, we accept the axioms of Euclidean geometry because they express truths about space that we can directly verify in pure spatial intuition. The axiom that a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points is not an arbitrary stipulation. It is a truth about space, about the structure of space as we intuit it, that we can verify directly by pure spatial intuition. The axiom that parallel lines never meet is not arbitrary. It describes a feature of Euclidean space that we can grasp directly in spatial intuition. This is what Kant meant when he said that mathematical knowledge is synthetic a priori, both genuinely informative and known independently of empirical experience. Mathematical truths are not merely analytic, not true simply by virtue of the meanings of the terms involved, not derivable by pure logical analysis from definitions. They are synthetic. They tell us something substantive about the structure of space and time. And they are a priori, known independently of any particular empirical observation, grounded in pure intuition rather than in sensory experience. The principle of sufficient reason of being captures this. The ground of a mathematical truth is not another truth from which it follows by logical inference, or not only that. More fundamentally, the ground is the spatial or temporal structure that the truth describes, the being of space or time as grasped in pure intuition. We know that the opposite angles formed by 2 intersecting lines are equal, not merely because we can derive this from axioms by logical steps, but because we can see it directly in the spatial figure, because the spatial structure itself makes it impossible for things to be otherwise. Section 30. The ground of being in space. Let me now go through the ground of being as it operates in geometry, in the domain of space. The key point is this: geometrical truths have 2 kinds of ground, a logical ground and an intuitive ground, and these are not the same thing. The logical ground of a theorem is the proof, the chain of logical steps from axioms to conclusion. The intuitive ground is the spatial structure itself, the way space is, which makes the theorem true and which can be directly perceived in pure spatial intuition. These 2 grounds often diverge sharply. The logical proof of a theorem may be long, complex, and difficult to follow. It may require many steps and much ingenuity to construct. But the intuitive ground may be immediately obvious. Once you see the right spatial figure, the truth of the theorem is self-evident, requiring no further argument. Conversely, a very simple logical proof may give little intuitive insight into why the theorem is true. It may establish the truth without illuminating the spatial structure that underlies it. This divergence between proof and intuition is one of the most interesting features of mathematical knowledge, and it has been handled very differently by different philosophical traditions. The rationalist tradition, going back to Descartes and Leibniz, and carried forward by Wolff and the German academic philosophy of Schopenhauer's time, tended to privilege logical proof over intuition. For this tradition, genuine mathematical knowledge consists in logical derivation from clear and distinct concepts. Intuition, direct spatial or temporal perception, is unreliable, subject to illusion, incapable of the universality and necessity that genuine knowledge requires. What we should seek is not intuitive insight, but rigorous logical proof that makes no appeal to any spatial figure or temporal sequence, but proceeds by pure logical steps from self-evident axioms. I reject this view entirely. Logical proof without intuitive grounding is empty. It establishes conclusions without illuminating why they are true. The spatial figure, the diagram, the construction, is not a mere psychological aid for weak minds that cannot follow abstract argument. It is the actual ground of the geometrical truth. It shows why the truth holds, by showing directly the spatial structure that makes it impossible for things to be otherwise. Consider the Pythagorean theorem, the theorem that in a right triangle, the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides. There are many logical proofs of this theorem, hundreds, in fact, accumulated over centuries. Each proof establishes the theorem's truth by deriving it from axioms by logical steps. But the most illuminating proofs are those that show why the theorem is true, that reveal the spatial structure underlying it, that make the spatial relationships visible in such a way that the truth becomes intuitively evident. The famous proof by rearrangement, in which the squares on the sides of the right triangle are physically rearranged to show that they fit together exactly, does this. It does not just establish that the areas are equal, it shows why they are equal, by making the spatial relationship directly visible. This is the ground of being at work, the spatial structure itself, directly perceived, providing the ultimate ground for the mathematical truth. The logicist tradition in mathematics, the tradition of Frege, Russell, and their successors, aimed to reduce all of mathematics to pure logic, to derive every mathematical truth from purely logical axioms by purely logical steps, making no essential appeal to spatial or temporal intuition. This project, whatever its technical achievements, is philosophically misguided from my point of view. It mistakes the formal structure of mathematical proof for the epistemic ground of mathematical truth. Even if every mathematical theorem can be derived by logical steps from logical axioms, which is itself a highly contested claim, this derivation does not explain why the axioms are true, why the logical steps are valid, why the whole system hangs together as a coherent body of knowledge rather than as an arbitrary formal game. The answers to these questions lie in intuition, in the direct grasp of spatial and temporal structure, not in logic. Section 31. The ground of being in time. Arithmetic. Everything I have said about geometry and the ground of being in space applies, mutatis mutandis, to arithmetic and the ground of being in time. Time, for Kant, is the pure form of inner intuition, the form in which we are aware of our own inner states and their succession. And arithmetic, on Kant's view, is grounded in the pure intuition of time, in the direct grasp of temporal succession and the counting that is based on it. The natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, and so on, are grounded in the temporal succession of moments. To count is to track a sequence of moments, marking each one and moving to the next. The number 5 is not an abstract concept that floats free of any intuitive content. It is grounded in the intuition of a sequence of 5 moments, 5 strokes, 5 beats. The arithmetical truth that 5 plus 7 equals 12 is not a purely logical truth. Its denial is not a logical contradiction in the formal sense. It is a synthetic truth. It tells us something substantive about the structure of temporal sequences, and it is grounded in the pure intuition of time. This is why even the simplest arithmetical calculations feel like discoveries rather than mere logical unpackings of definitions. When I work out that 347 times 893 equals 309,971, I am not merely unpacking something that was already contained in the meanings of the numbers. I am discovering a substantive truth about how temporal sequences of these sizes combine, a truth that, however certain it may be once established, was not immediately obvious and required genuine cognitive work to arrive at. The ground of being in time, the temporal structure that grounds arithmetical truths, is less spatially vivid than the ground of being in space. We cannot draw a diagram of an arithmetical truth the way we can of a geometrical truth. But the intuitive grounding is there nonetheless, in the direct grasp of temporal sequences and their combinations that underlies all counting and calculation. There is one important difference between the ground of being in space and the ground of being in time that deserves mention. Space has three dimensions, and this three-dimensionality is an essential feature of the spatial truths of geometry. Time has only one dimension, the single linear succession of moments from past through present to future. This one-dimensionality of time gives arithmetic a simpler and more uniform structure than geometry. Arithmetic is, in a sense, the simplest possible mathematics, the mathematics of a one-dimensional structure, while geometry is the mathematics of a three-dimensional structure with correspondingly greater richness and complexity. This also means that the ground of being in time, the intuitive grounding of arithmetic, is in a certain sense more transparent and more immediately certain than the ground of being in space. The basic truths of arithmetic feel more self-evident, more directly grounded in an intuition that is impossible to doubt than even the simplest geometrical truths. That 7 plus 5 equals 12 seems more immediately certain than that the angles of a triangle sum to two right angles, even though both are synthetic, a priori truths grounded in pure intuition. The reason, I think, is this. The intuition of time, of temporal succession, is so fundamental to consciousness itself, so deeply built into the structure of inner experience, that the truths grounded in it feel like truths about the very fabric of experience, rather than truths about a specific domain of objects. Time is the form of all inner experience, the medium in which consciousness exists. Arithmetical truths, grounded in the pure form of time, therefore carry a sense of absolute inevitability that even geometrical truths, grounded in the somewhat more external form of space, do not quite match. Section 32. Why mathematical proofs must appeal to intuition. I want to conclude this discussion of the third form of the principle of sufficient reason by addressing a question that arises naturally from what I have said. If mathematical truths are grounded in pure intuition, if the ground of being in space and time is the ultimate basis of mathematical knowledge, then why do we bother with logical proof at all? Why not simply appeal to intuition directly and dispense with the elaborate machinery of axiomatic proof? The answer has two parts. The first part is that intuition, while reliable in its own domain, has limits. It is reliable for simple, immediately visible spatial and temporal relationships. But as geometrical figures become more complex and the spatial relationships involved become harder to visualize directly, intuition becomes unreliable. We cannot reliably visualize the spatial relationships involved in a theorem about a figure with many sides, or in a theorem about three-dimensional relationships between complex solids. In these cases, logical proof, rigorous deduction from axioms, is necessary to extend our knowledge beyond what pure intuition can directly verify. But, and this is the crucial point, logical proof extends our intuitive knowledge. It does not replace it. The axioms from which the proof proceeds are themselves grounded in intuition. The rules of logical inference used in the proof are themselves intuitively evident. The proof connects the theorem to the axioms through a chain of intuitive steps. Each step is itself directly evident, even if the connection between the axioms and the distant theorem could not be seen directly without the intermediary steps. So, logical proof in mathematics is a way of extending the reach of intuition, of using the direct evidence of simple intuitive steps to establish complex truths that cannot be grasped directly in a single act of intuition. The proof does not undermine the grounding of mathematics in intuition. It builds on it, step by step. The second part of the answer is that logical proof provides something that direct intuition alone cannot. It provides certainty about universality. When I directly intuit a geometrical relationship in a specific figure, I see that it holds for this figure. But I need the logical proof, which proceeds from axioms that express general truths about all figures of the relevant kind, to establish that it holds for all figures of this kind, not just for this particular one. This is the connection between the ground of being, the intuitive ground, and the ground of knowing, the logical ground. The intuitive ground tells me why the truth holds, what spatial or temporal structure makes it true. The logical ground, the proof, tells me that it holds universally, for all cases of the relevant kind, not just for the particular case I happen to be considering. Both kinds of ground are needed. The intuitive ground without the logical proof gives me insight without universality. The logical proof without the intuitive ground gives me universality without insight. Together, they give me genuine mathematical knowledge, universal, necessary, and intuitively illuminating. This is, I believe, the correct account of mathematical knowledge, and it vindicates Kant's fundamental insight that mathematical knowledge is synthetic a priori, while correcting his insufficient emphasis on the role of spatial and temporal construction in proof. Mathematical truth is grounded in pure intuition, in the being of space and time as the mind contributes them to experience. And the principle of sufficient reason of being, the demand that every mathematical truth have a ground in this pure intuition, is the third form of the fundamental principle that governs all human knowledge. Section 33, the fourth class of objects and the principle of sufficient reason of acting. We have now worked through three of the four forms of the principle of sufficient reason. The first, the principle of sufficient reason of becoming, governs the physical world of cause and effect. The second, the principle of sufficient reason of knowing, governs the logical domain of concepts and judgments. The third, the principle of sufficient reason of being, governs the mathematical domain of pure space and time. Now we come to the fourth and final form, the one that is in certain respects the most important of all, because it touches most directly on what we are as human beings. The fourth form is the principle of sufficient reason of acting. It governs the fourth class of objects, which is unlike the other three classes in a fundamental way. The objects of the first three classes are all, in one sense or another, objects for a subject. Things that appear before a knowing subject, things that are known, perceived, thought about, intuited. They are all on the object side of the subject-object divide. The fourth class is different. It consists not of objects known from the outside, but of the subject itself. Specifically, the subject as agent, the self as the one who wills and acts. This fourth class has exactly one member. It is the subject of willing, the inner self as known from within, not as perceived from without. It is what each of us means when we say, I, in the deepest sense. Not I as a body in space, not I as a stream of thoughts and perceptions, but I as the one who wants, who chooses, who acts, who strives. And the form of the principle of sufficient reason that governs this domain is the law of motivation. Every act of will has a motive. Given a motive acting on a subject with a particular character, a particular act of will necessarily follows. Motivation is causality operating through the medium of knowledge. It is causality internalized, made to run not through the external application of physical force, but through the inner awareness of reasons and goals. I have already introduced this point in my discussion of the three kinds of causality: mechanical cause, stimulus, and motive. There I placed motivation within the domain of causality as its highest and most internalized form. Now I need to develop it more fully and to say what is distinctive about the fourth form of the principle of sufficient reason compared to the first three. Section 34. The subject of willing as a special kind of object. The subject of willing, the self as agent, is known in a way that is completely different from the way anything else is known. Everything else we know is known through the forms of outer or inner intuition, through space, through time, through the application of the categories of the understanding. We know the physical world through perception, through the application of causality to sensory data. We know abstract truths through concepts and logical inference. We know mathematical truths through pure spatial and temporal intuition. But we know the self as agent, the subject of willing differently. We know it from the inside, through what I call inner sense, in the most direct possible meaning of that term. When I act, when I raise my arm, when I reach for a glass of water, when I turn away from a temptation, I am immediately aware of two things at once. I am aware of the bodily movement, the arm rising, the hand reaching, the body turning, as an event in the physical world, perceivable from outside just like any other physical event. And I am aware of the act of will that produced it, the volition, the wanting, the deciding, as an inner event known directly and immediately from within, not mediated by any sensory organ or any process of inference. These two, the bodily movement and the act of will, are not two separate events that happen to occur together. They are the same event seen from two different sides. The act of will is the inner reality of which the bodily movement is the outer appearance. When I raise my arm, the raising of the arm and the willing to raise the arm are not cause and effect. They are not two things, with the willing causing the movement as the hammer's striking causes the nail's movement. They are one and the same thing, known in two different ways, from without as a bodily movement in space, and from within as an act of will. This is one of the most important and most original points in my entire philosophy, and I cannot develop it fully here, since it belongs to the larger metaphysical system I have laid out in my chief work. But I need to state it clearly in this context, because it bears directly on the nature of the fourth form of the principle of sufficient reason. If the act of will and the bodily movement are the same event known in two different ways, then the relationship between motivation and bodily action is not a causal relationship in the ordinary sense, not the relationship of one physical event causing another. It is a relationship of expression. The motive is the inner cause. The bodily movement is the outer expression of the will that responded to the motive. The causality involved is real, given the motive and the character of the agent. The act of will and its bodily expression follow necessarily. But it is causality of a special kind, causality that operates through knowledge, through the inner awareness of reasons and goals, and that manifests itself simultaneously as inner volition and outer movement. Section 35. Motivation and character. Now I need to say something precise about how motivation works, about the relationship between motive, character, and action. The law of motivation says every act of will has a motive. But what exactly is a motive, and how does it produce its effect? A motive is a representation, a perceived or thought object that moves the will. It is the cause that operates through knowledge. The food I see moves me to reach for it. The danger I perceive moves me to flee. The principle I hold moves me to act in accordance with it. In each case, the representation, the perceived food, the perceived danger, the consciously held principle, is the motive, and the act of will, the reaching, the fleeing, the principled action, is the effect. But here is the crucial point. The same motive does not produce the same action in every person, or even in the same person at different times. The action that results from a motive depends not just on the motive, but on the character of the person in whom the motive operates. Character is the permanent, innate nature of a person, the specific way in which their will is constituted, the particular things they want and value and respond to. Character is what makes one person respond to a perceived opportunity with boldness and another with caution. One person respond to a perceived insult with anger and another with amusement. One person respond to a perceived suffering in others with compassion, and another with indifference. Character, in my view, is innate. It is not acquired through experience or formed through habit or chosen by the agent. It is given. Each person comes into existence with a particular character, a particular constitution of will, and that character remains fundamentally constant throughout their life, however much their behavior may vary with circumstances, and however much their knowledge and understanding may develop. What changes as we mature and as we accumulate experience is not our character, but our knowledge, our understanding of the situations we find ourselves in, our grasp of the means available to achieve our ends, our awareness of the consequences of various courses of action. The character that determines what we fundamentally want, what we ultimately value and strive for, this remains constant. This has a profound implication. Given a motive acting on a person with a particular character, the resulting act of will is determined with the same necessity as any physical effect following from its cause. The person could not, in that moment, have acted otherwise, not because they were physically compelled, not because some external force prevented them from doing otherwise, but because their character, their fundamental constitution of will, combined with their knowledge of the situation, made this action the inevitable expression of who they are. This is what I mean when I say that the will, considered as it operates in the world of experience, is fully subject to the law of causality, in this case, the law of motivation. Acts of will are not uncaused eruptions from some mysterious realm of freedom. They are the necessary consequences of motives acting on characters, causes producing effects with the same necessity that governs every other causal process in the world of experience. Section 36. Freedom of the will. This brings me directly to the question of the freedom of the will, one of the most contested questions in all of philosophy, and one that has generated more confusion than almost any other. Let me be direct. In the empirical sense, in the sense of a will that is not subject to the law of motivation, that can act without a sufficient motive, that can, in identical circumstances, produce different actions, free will does not exist. The will, as it operates in the world of experience, is fully determined. Every act of will has a sufficient cause in the motive that prompted it, and the character of the agent through whom it operated. Given these, the action was inevitable. This conclusion follows directly from taking seriously what we have established about causality and motivation. If motivation is a genuine form of causality, if motives really do cause actions with genuine necessity, then the actions of rational beings are just as determined as the motions of physical bodies. The medium is different. Motivation operates through knowledge, while mechanical causality operates through physical force. But the necessity is the same. The persistent belief in free will in the empirical sense. The belief that the will can act without a sufficient cause. That in identical circumstances a person could have done otherwise than they did, rests on an illusion. It is an illusion generated by the peculiar nature of the inner knowledge we have of our own will. From the inside, the act of willing feels free. It feels like the expression of who I am, like something that comes from me rather than being imposed on me from outside. And this feeling is not entirely wrong. The action does express who I am. It does come from my character. But the feeling of freedom is confused with the absence of determination, and that is the illusion. The action is free in the sense of flowing from the agent's own character, rather than from external compulsion. It is not free in the sense of being uncaused, undetermined, capable of being otherwise given everything that preceded it. But, and this is where the matter becomes genuinely deep, there is another sense in which freedom is real. If the character of the agent is the proximate cause of action, if who we are determines what we do, then the question of freedom pushes back a level. Not, could this person, with this character, have done otherwise in this situation? But, could this person have had a different character? Could the fundamental constitution of will that makes them who they are have been different? And here we reach the limit of the empirical perspective, the perspective of the world as representation, as the domain of cause and effect unfolding in space and time. Within the empirical world, character is given. It is the fixed starting point from which all action proceeds, the immovable foundation that cannot itself be caused or chosen within the domain of experience. But character, I argue, is the direct expression of the will as thing in itself. The will considered not as it appears in the world of experience, but as it is in its own inner nature, prior to all appearance, prior to all individuation in space and time. And the will as thing in itself, as the inner reality that underlies all appearance, is not subject to the principle of sufficient reason in any of its four forms. The principle of sufficient reason, as I have now shown across all four of its forms, is a principle that governs the world of representation, the world as it appears to a knowing subject. It governs phenomena, things as they appear, not things as they are in themselves. The will as thing in itself lies outside the domain of the principle. It is, in the deepest sense, free. Not free in the sense of being undetermined within the world of experience, but free in the sense of being the ultimate ground of the world of experience itself, the reality that appears as the determined, causally governed world of representation. This is the sense in which Kant was right to insist on the compatibility of natural determinism and transcendental freedom, though I think he did not locate the insight in quite the right place. The transcendental freedom he was reaching for is not the freedom of a noumenal, rational will that somehow intervenes in the causal order of nature. It is the freedom of the will as the thing in itself, the freedom of the ultimate reality that appears as the determined world of cause and effect without being exhausted by that appearance. I cannot develop this further here. It belongs to the metaphysics of my chief work, but I want to state the conclusion clearly. The fourth form of the principle of sufficient reason, the law of motivation, fully governs the world of action as it appears in experience. No act of will in the empirical world is without its sufficient motive. Empirical freedom of will, the freedom to act without a cause, is an illusion. But this empirical determinism is entirely compatible with a deeper freedom that belongs to the will as thing in itself, a freedom that is not a freedom within the causal order, but a freedom from the causal order, the freedom of the ultimate reality that the causal order expresses and reveals without containing or exhausting. Section 37. The subject of knowing in its relation to the subject of willing. I have now presented all four forms of the principle of sufficient reason. Before drawing the threads together into a unified conclusion, I need to address one more topic that is essential for a complete understanding of the fourth form, the relationship between the knowing subject and the willing subject, between the intellect and the will. Throughout this work, I have spoken of the subject as the knower, the one pole of the fundamental subject-object relation that underlies all experience. The subject, as I described it in the opening sections of the previous chapter, is that which knows everything and is itself known by nothing. It is the precondition of all objects, the necessary correlate of every representation. It has no size, no location, no properties that could be perceived or measured. It is not in space or time. But now, in treating the fourth form of the principle of sufficient reason, I have introduced a second aspect of the self, the subject not as knower, but as agent, not as the one who represents, but as the one who wills. And the question naturally arises, what is the relationship between these two? Is the knowing subject and the willing subject one and the same thing, or are they two different things? The answer, in brief, is this. They are one and the same individual, the same human being, but they represent two fundamentally different aspects of what that individual is. And the relationship between these two aspects is not a relationship between equals. The will is primary. It is the deeper, more fundamental reality. The intellect, the knowing subject, is secondary. It is an instrument of the will, a tool that the will has developed in the course of biological evolution to serve its own purposes. This is one of the most radical and most important theses of my philosophy, and it runs directly counter to the entire tradition of Western rationalism, which since Plato has consistently privileged the intellect over the will. For the rationalist tradition, the intellect, reason, is the highest and most essential part of human nature. The will, in this tradition, is a lower faculty, the faculty of desire and appetite, that is properly subject to the governance of reason. The good human life consists in the domination of will by intellect, in acting according to reason rather than appetite, in following the guidance of clear and distinct ideas rather than the promptings of blind desire. I invert this hierarchy completely. The will is not the servant of the intellect. The intellect is the servant of the will. Knowing, consciousness, representation, all of this is in the service of willing. The intellect evolved, was developed by the will in the course of animal evolution, precisely as an instrument for serving the will's ends more effectively. In simple animals, the will operates through reflex and instinct, through direct stimulus-response mechanisms that require no conscious representation. In more complex animals, and above all in humans, the will has developed an elaborate cognitive apparatus, senses, nervous system, brain, intellect, that allows it to pursue its ends with vastly greater sophistication and effectiveness. But this apparatus remains what it always was, a means to an end. The end is the will's own expression and satisfaction. The means is knowing. This is why the intellect is so often unreliable as a guide, why it so easily rationalizes what the will already wants, why it so persistently mistakes the will's desires for rational conclusions, why it is so susceptible to self-deception. The intellect is not an independent faculty that objectively surveys reality and reports back to the will what it finds. It is an instrument shaped by the will's needs and biases, one that tends to see what the will wants to see, to find reasons for what the will already wants to do, to construct justifications for conclusions that the will has already reached through non-rational channels. This insight, that the intellect is secondary to and in the service of the will, has profound implications for how we understand human behavior, human motivation, human self-knowledge, and the limits of rational self-governance. And it connects directly to what I said in the previous section about freedom of the will. The will is not governed by reason. It is not the case that we first rationally determine what is good and then will it. Rather, we will what we will. We want what our character disposes us to want. And then the intellect goes to work constructing reasons for what we already want, and rationalizing the actions that flow from our character. This does not mean that reason and knowledge are powerless. They are not. Knowledge, including self-knowledge, including moral insight, can modify the expression of the will in the world. A person who comes to understand clearly the consequences of their actions, who develops genuine compassion through a deeper knowledge of the suffering of others, who achieves a clear-eyed perception of the emptiness of the goals they have been pursuing, such a person may act differently than they would have without that knowledge. But the change is not a change in the will's fundamental nature. It is a change in the way the will expresses itself, given a transformed understanding of its situation. Section 38. The knowing subject as the world I. There is one more aspect of the knowing subject that I want to bring into focus before moving to the conclusion of this work. It concerns the peculiar nature of the subject of knowing, as I described it in the opening sections, the subject that knows everything and is itself known by nothing. That is the precondition of all objects without itself being an object. I described this subject as having no location, no size, no properties that could be perceived. It is not in space. It is not in time. It is, in a certain sense, the point from which all space and time are seen, the 0 point of the coordinate system of experience, the position from which the world is mapped without itself appearing on the map. I call this the world eye. The knowing subject is the eye of the world, the point through which the world becomes visible to itself, the aperture through which reality achieves self-awareness. And like an eye, the knowing subject is invisible to itself in the act of seeing. The eye that sees everything cannot see itself seeing. The subject that knows everything cannot know itself as it knows. It can only know the objects that appear before it, never the act of appearing itself. This creates a peculiar situation. Every human being is, in one aspect, a particular individual, a body in space, a character in time, a set of specific qualities and properties that can be perceived and described from outside. But in another aspect, every human being is the world eye, the knowing subject, the point of consciousness through which the entire world is illuminated. And in this second aspect, every human being is not a particular thing among other things, but the precondition of all things, the condition without which there would be no world at all, at least no world as known. This is not a mystical claim. It follows directly from the analysis of the subject-object relation with which this work began. The subject is the necessary correlate of every object. Remove the subject and the world of objects, the world of representation, disappears. Not because the subject creates the world out of nothing, but because the world as known, the world as it appears, the world of representation, is constituted by the relation between subject and object, and cannot exist without both terms of the relation. Every individual knowing subject is, from this perspective, the world entire, not in extent, not in content, but in the transcendental sense of being the condition of the world's appearance. This is one of the deepest points of convergence between my philosophy and certain ancient philosophical and religious traditions. The Upanishadic identification of the individual self with Brahman, the world soul. The Buddhist doctrine of the identity of individual consciousness with the universal consciousness underlying all phenomena. The Neoplatonic identification of the individual intellect with the divine nous. These traditions, in their different ways, were groping toward the same insight that the analysis of the subject-object relation makes philosophically precise, that the individual knowing subject, in its capacity as knower, is not a particular thing within the world, but the condition of the world's existence as a known world. But I do not want to go further in this direction here. These matters belong to the metaphysics and to the discussion of the denial of the will, the practical philosophy that occupies the final sections of my chief work. Here I am concerned with the theory of knowledge and with the principle of sufficient reason as a theory of the conditions of all possible knowledge. Let me return to that theory and bring it to its conclusion. Section 39. The boundaries of the principle of sufficient reason. One of the most important lessons of this entire investigation is a lesson about limits, about where the principle of sufficient reason applies and where it does not. The principle, in all four of its forms, is a principle that governs the world of representation, the world as it appears to a knowing subject. It governs the relationships between representations, between physical events as perceived, between concepts as thought, between mathematical truths as intuited, between acts of will as known through inner sense. In every domain, the principle says, nothing stands alone. Everything is connected to something else, to its cause, to its logical ground, to its mathematical ground, to its motive. The world of representation is a world of thoroughgoing relativity. Every element of it is what it is only in relation to other elements, through the connections that the principle of sufficient reason governs. This thoroughgoing relativity of the world of representation is both its character and its limitation. It is its character because it makes the world knowable. Knowledge just is the grasp of these relations, the tracing of causes and effects, reasons and consequences, grounds and conclusions. The principle of sufficient reason is the form of all knowledge. To know something is to know its place in the network of relations that the principle governs. But it is also a limitation, because it means that the world of representation, taken as a whole, is not self-explanatory. The network of relations that the principle governs is a network within the world of representation. It connects representations to other representations, events to other events, concepts to other concepts. It does not connect the world of representation as a whole to anything outside it. It does not explain why there is a world of representation at all, why there is something rather than nothing, why the world is the way it is rather than some other way. These questions, the deepest questions of metaphysics, cannot be answered by the principle of sufficient reason. They cannot be answered because the principle is a principle of connection within the world of representation, not a principle that connects the world of representation to something beyond it. To ask for the cause of the world, or the reason for the world, or the motive of the world, is to apply the principle beyond its proper domain, to extend it into a region where it has no application, and where its application generates only illusion and confusion. This is what Kant meant by the transcendental illusions of reason, the illusions generated when reason, driven by its insatiable demand for grounds, extends the principles of possible experience beyond the limits of possible experience. The cosmological idea of a first cause, the idea of a beginning of the causal series that is itself uncaused, is one of these illusions. It arises when we apply the law of causality, which governs changes within experience, to the world as a whole, asking for the cause of the world's existence. But I go further than Kant. Kant thought the questions that generate these illusions are genuine questions that simply cannot be answered, questions to which reason naturally and inevitably reaches, but which the structure of human knowledge makes permanently inaccessible. I think these questions are not genuine questions at all. They are pseudo-questions generated by the misapplication of concepts beyond their proper domain. The question, what caused the world, is not a deep question whose answer is beyond our reach. It is a malformed question, a question that applies the concept of causality in a context where it has no meaning. The limit of the principle of sufficient reason is not a frustrating barrier that keeps us from the answers we seek. It is a clarifying boundary that shows us the structure of the world we can know, and that points, indirectly, toward what lies beyond that world. What lies beyond, what the world of representation expresses without being, is the will. Not the individual human will, not the will as it appear in the fourth form of the principle, but the will as thing in itself. The blind, striving, insatiable force that is the inner nature of everything that exists, that expresses itself in the determined, causally governed, rationally ordered world of representation without being captured or contained by that expression. But that is the subject of a different and larger work. This work has a more modest and more specific aim, to present, clearly and precisely, the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, to distinguish its four forms from one another, to identify the source of each form in the structure of human cognition, and to mark the boundaries within which each form applies. That aim, I believe I have now fulfilled. Section 40. Conclusion. The fourfold root summarized. Let me now gather everything together. This entire work has been devoted to a single thesis, that the principle of sufficient reason is not one principle but four, each with its own domain, its own source in the human mind, and its own kind of necessity. Let me state this thesis one final time, as clearly and completely as possible. The general formula of the principle of sufficient reason, the formula that encompasses all four forms, is this. Nothing is without a ground why it is rather than not. Everything that exists, everything that is true, everything that happens, everything that is willed, all of it stands in a relation of necessary connection to something else from which it follows. Nothing floats free. Nothing is self-sufficient and self-explanatory. Everything points beyond itself to something else, to its cause, its reason, its ground, its motive. This general formula, however, conceals beneath its apparent unity a deep, fourfold structure. The something else to which things point, the ground, is not the same kind of thing in every case. It varies with the kind of thing that is being grounded, and the variation is not merely a matter of degree or emphasis. It is a fundamental variation in kind, in the nature of the grounding relation, in the domain within which it operates, and in the source from which it flows in the human mind. Here, then, is the fourfold root, stated as precisely and concisely as I can manage. The first root: the principle of sufficient reason of becoming. Domain: the physical world, the world of objects in space and time, the world of complete empirical representations. Form of the ground: cause. Every change in the physical world has a cause, a prior state from which it followed necessarily according to the laws of nature. Kind of necessity: physical necessity. Given the cause and the laws of nature, the effect could not but occur. Source in the human mind: the understanding, specifically, the faculty of causal inference that operates already at the level of perception, transforming raw sensory data into the perception of an objective external world. Misuses to avoid: applying causality to the existence of the world as a whole rather than to changes within the world. Using causality to demand a first cause or an uncaused cause. Confusing physical causality with logical grounding. The second root: the principle of sufficient reason of knowing. Domain: the abstract world, the world of concepts and judgments, the world of abstract representations. Form of the ground: logical reason. Every judgment that claims to be knowledge must have a sufficient ground, something in virtue of which it is true, something from which its truth follows. Kind of necessity: logical necessity. A judgment that follows from its ground cannot be false without contradiction. Given the ground, the judgment must be true. Source in the human mind: reason, the faculty of abstract thought and logical inference, which organizes concepts into systems of knowledge connected by relations of ground and consequence. Misuses to avoid: treating logical grounds as if they were physical causes, deriving real causal conclusions from purely logical premises. Confusing the logical order of knowing with the real order of being. The ontological proof is the paradigm case of this misuse. The third root: the principle of sufficient reason of being. Domain: the mathematical world, the pure forms of space and time, the objects of geometry and arithmetic. Form of the ground, ground of being. Every mathematical truth has a ground in the pure intuition of space or time, in the spatial or temporal structure that makes the truth not just derivable but intuitively evident. Kind of necessity: mathematical necessity. A mathematical truth is one that could not be otherwise given the structure of space or time, not merely one that follows logically from arbitrarily chosen axioms. Source in the human mind: pure intuition, the faculty by which the mind grasps the structure of space and time directly, prior to all empirical experience, and constructs mathematical truths by operating within and upon that structure. Misuses to avoid: reducing mathematical truth to pure logical truth, treating the axioms of mathematics as arbitrary stipulations and the theorems as their merely logical consequences. This reduction misses the intuitive ground that makes mathematics both synthetic and a priori. The fourth root: the principle of sufficient reason of acting. Domain: the domain of the will, the subject of willing as known from within through inner sense. Form of the ground. Motive. Every act of will has a motive, a representation that moves the will by being perceived or thought, acting as a cause through the medium of knowledge. Kind of necessity. Moral necessity, where moral is used in the technical sense of necessity, operating through knowledge and character rather than through physical force. Given the motive and the character of the agent, the act of will follows necessarily. Source in the human mind. Inner sense. The direct, immediate awareness each person has of their own willing, an awareness that is unlike all outer knowledge, because it is the one case in which we know from the inside what everywhere else we know only from the outside. Misuses to avoid, treating the will as uncaused, as exempt from the principle of sufficient reason in the name of a freedom that is really just randomness dressed up in moral language. And on the other side, treating motivation as a simple variety of mechanical causation, missing what is distinctive about the way causes operate through knowledge. The unity beneath the fourfold structure. Having distinguished the four forms as sharply as possible, let me say something about what they have in common, about the unity that underlies the fourfold structure. All four forms share the same basic logical structure. There is always a ground and a grounded. There is always a relation of necessary connection between them, such that, given the grounded follows and could not fail to follow. And in every case, the ground and the grounded belong to the same class of objects. Causes and their effects are both physical events, logical reasons, and their consequences are both judgments. Mathematical grounds and their grounded truths are both mathematical propositions. Motives and their resultant acts of will are both elements of the inner life of a conscious being. This last point, that the ground and the grounded always belong to the same class, is important. It is part of what I mean when I say that the principle must not be applied across class boundaries. A physical event cannot be the logical ground of a judgment. A mathematical truth cannot be the motive of an act of will. The principle operates within classes, not across them. And the misuses of the principle that have caused the most damage in the history of philosophy are precisely those that apply it across class boundaries, using a logical relation to do the work of a causal relation, using a causal argument to establish a mathematical truth, using a motivational explanation to replace a physical causal account. All four forms also share a common source, the human cognitive apparatus, considered as a whole. The understanding provides the first form, the causal law that governs perception and physical explanation. Reason provides the second form, the demand for logical grounds that governs abstract knowledge. Pure intuition provides the third form, the spatial and temporal structure that grounds mathematical truth. Inner sense provides the fourth form, the direct awareness of willing that gives us knowledge of motivation. These four cognitive faculties are not four separate and unrelated modules. They are four aspects of a single unified cognitive apparatus, the human mind as a whole, considered from four different angles. And underlying all four forms is the most fundamental feature of human cognition, the subject-object structure of consciousness itself. All knowledge is knowledge of objects by a subject. The principle of sufficient reason, in all four of its forms, is a principle about how objects are related to one another within the world of the subject's experience. It is the form of all objectivity, the structure that makes the world of experience a coherent, intelligible, interconnected whole, rather than a chaos of unrelated impressions. What the principle does not explain. I have insisted throughout this work on the limits of the principle, on what it cannot explain and what questions it cannot answer. Let me gather these limitations together. The principle cannot explain why the world exists at all. The first form, causality, governs changes within the world, not the existence of the world. The second form, logical ground, governs the connections between judgments, not the existence of the things the judgments are about. The third form, mathematical ground, governs the structure of space and time, not the question of why space and time exist. The fourth form, motivation, governs the acts of individual wills, not the existence of will as such. The principle cannot explain the specific natures of things, why water has the properties it has, why light travels at the speed it does, why the will takes the particular forms it takes in different individuals and species. These natures are simply given. They are the starting points of all causal and motivational explanation, not themselves explicable by that explanation. The principle cannot explain its own ultimate ground. It cannot answer the question of why there is a principle of sufficient reason at all, why the world is ordered by necessary connections rather than being a chaos. This question, as I noted earlier, is not a genuine question, but a pseudo-question. It applies the principle to itself, demanding a ground for the principle of ground, generating an infinite regress that dissolves on examination. And the principle cannot reach the thing in itself, the inner reality that underlies and expresses itself through the world of representation without being captured by it. The world of representation, the world the principle governs, is the world of appearances. Beneath appearances lies the thing in itself. And the thing in itself, which I identify as will, is not subject to the principle of sufficient reason in any of its four forms. It is the ground of the world, not something within the world that requires a ground. This last point is the most important. The principle of sufficient reason governs the world as representation, the world as it appears to a knowing subject. It does not govern the will as thing in itself, the world as it is in its own inner nature. The will is free, not in the empirical sense of being uncaused within the world of experience, but in the transcendental sense of being the ground of the world of experience, the reality that the principle governs without itself being governed by it. This is the deepest result of the entire investigation. The principle of sufficient reason is the most fundamental principle of the world as representation, the form of all objectivity, the structure of all knowledge, the law of all appearance. And precisely for that reason, it points beyond itself, to the will as thing in itself, to the reality that appears through the principle without being exhausted by it, to the answer to the question that the principle itself cannot answer. What is the world in its innermost nature? That question and its answer belong to my chief work. This work has laid the foundation. It has shown what the principle of sufficient reason is, what it governs, where it comes from, and where it ends. With that foundation in place, the larger metaphysical investigation can proceed on solid ground. A final word on method. I want to close with a word about method, about the kind of philosophical work this has been and what I hope it achieves. Philosophy, in my view, is not the construction of elaborate systems, not the derivation of the structure of reality from a single first principle, not the unfolding of the absolute through dialectical self-development, not the reduction of all knowledge to a set of axioms from which everything else follows by logical deduction. These ambitions, the ambitions of the great system builders from Descartes through Leibniz and Wolff to Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, are misguided. They mistake the logical order of exposition for the real order of things. They try to derive from concepts what can only be known through intuition and experience. They produce elaborate and impressive-looking structures that collapse on examination because they are built on nothing, on the shifting sands of conceptual manipulation, rather than on the firm ground of genuine insight. Genuine philosophy, as I practice it, begins with the facts, with the actual structure of human experience and human knowledge as they are. It proceeds by careful, rigorous analysis, by distinguishing what has been confused, separating what has been lumped together, identifying precisely what each cognitive faculty contributes to each domain of knowledge. And it aims at clarity, not the false clarity of a smooth and seamless system in which all difficulties have been dissolved by sleight of hand, but the genuine clarity of a view that is honest about what it sees and honest about what it cannot see. This work, the analysis of the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, is an exercise in this kind of philosophical analysis. It begins with a fact, the fact that the principle of sufficient reason is invoked across many different domains with many different meanings. It proceeds by analysis, by distinguishing the four forms of the principle, identifying their sources, and marking their limits. And it aims at genuine clarity, at a view of the structure of human knowledge that is precise enough to be useful and honest enough to acknowledge its own boundaries. Whether I have succeeded in this aim is for the reader to judge. But the aim itself, clarity, precision, honesty about limits, is, I believe, the right aim for philosophy. And it is an aim that the great tradition of German academic philosophy, in the generation that followed Kant, has almost entirely abandoned in favor of impression, mystification, and the pretense of depth. Against that tradition, against the willful obscurity of Fichte, the aesthetic system building of Schelling, and above all against the monstrous intellectual fraud of Hegel, this work stands as a small monument to the possibility of philosophical honesty. That is enough. The work is done. You have been listening to On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason, written by Arthur Schopenhauer. Copyright 2026 Alien, all rights reserved.